it didn't actually go live.
Yeah,
Did it
it
go
just says
live this
waiting on the
time?
stream that I'm looking at.
All right. Now it's just reloading over and over. Oh, there we go. It looks like I might actually be live.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it's loading something now. There we
I'm
go.
looking sideways at least. Are we good? Okay, cool. All right. Hey, everybody. Took a little while of going through error messages to go live, but it looks like we're up now. I'm going to be here with Jason Story, who you guys have probably seen on Charles's channel, and just telling him that he needs to start his own channel. Hey, Jason. Oh, I got a weird little box right behind you, so I'm just going to remove that. But yeah, welcome, man. Oh, it's chat. Never mind. Let me close that. First time doing this. There we go. Now you look better. Now you look like a person without a box sticking out of your head. Anyway, yeah, welcome, man. Just wanted to say hi, and I don't know if you wanted to say anything before we get going.
No, just glad to be here. I frequently join the Wednesday meetups that Jason hosts, and we have a lot of fun chats. So we thought we'd try doing it live this time.
Yeah, it should be interesting stuff. By the way, I have a live chat mode. I'm going to hit the button and see if it works. I don't see any chat in there. I was afraid that would happen, that I would set it up and then not see any actual chat. Oh, there we go. What do you know? There is chat in there. It's showing up. Saying hi, everyone. Cool. So I can turn up Jason's voice a little bit if he's a little low. Here. Or,
I'll nudge my mic a little bit too, just to
okay.
see if
Hopefully
that
that's
helps.
better. Does it sound better for everybody now? If not, let us know.
Apparently, I'm a bit echoey.
Well, that could have just been because I was blasting you out of my speakers and into my microphone. Okay. Try it one more time, see if you sound good.
Okay, how about now? Can everyone hear me?
Okay. Cool. Hopefully we're good and we can just get going. We were going to talk about a big list of stuff, just things that we thought every developer should know or know about at least. Just kind of running through a list of different things and maybe talking a bit about what those things are, what you should understand about them, maybe at a base level, and give you a kind of a jumping off point on where to go learn these things or get better at them, I guess. No, nothing really specific planned out. We just came up with a big long list of stuff. And we also, before we got started, we were having a discussion about coroutines really briefly. So I threw up a poll, and I thought it was really interesting because just when I was talking to Jason earlier, he said probably about 30% of people don't use coroutines. So I put up the poll, and I think I shared it with everybody in the chat. But here, let me see if just to do a real quick test on the desktop mode, if that shows up. See that? He was almost dead on. It looks like the percentages are just starting to mess with them now and go slowly down. It's at 23, but yeah, I don't know. That was just something I wanted to share for no real reason other than I thought it was interesting. That
Yeah, I
it
was
was so
surprised the first
close.
time too, but you know, same as you, I've done a lot of training and tutoring, and it seems to be, at least from my perspective, about 30% of people who seem to think that they're too daunting a topic, that they're kind of for asynchronous code or something, and that it's not something they can find regular use in. You know.
Yeah, that was like I was telling you earlier. That was my starting point. I thought, hey, coroutines, cool. They do threaded stuff, and I can just kick stuff off over to another thread. This, like when I first started out with Unity, and it took me a little while to realize, oh yeah, this is not threaded at all, and it's actually a little bit safer and a little bit easier, but not doing what I thought. So I could see why people don't use them, or why a subset of people aren't using them yet. Also, I was interested that a bigger chunk didn't know what they were. So I don't know if you noticed that on the poll results there. 15% just didn't even know what they were. So
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me too much. And even then, people who know what they are to use them in Unity still don't know what they are in terms of how they relate to enumerables. So I'm not too surprised that people don't use them very often or aren't too familiar with them.
yeah, same here. And then Nick's mentioning in chat that await and async and task stuff replaced a lot of his coroutine usage. Which I have to be honest, it happened for me on a lot of projects too, where we're being really strict about the just performance stuff and not kicking off coroutines just wildly. We're in the same boat
And
with.
also,
Oh, wait.
to my surprise, I found out that the invoke repeating functions can sometimes be faster than coroutines. You'd assume that it'd be worse, but it kind of profiles to be a bit faster than some coroutines if you're doing your own timers to repeat things.
Oh, interesting. I guess it kind of makes sense because with coroutines you have a little bit more power, so it's got to be doing something to
More
give you
overhead
back that
iterating and all
control.
that. Yeah.
And but I had never even considered it or thought about it. It's an interesting point. Cool. Well, let's just, I guess, jump over to our list real quick and go through some of the things. So the first thing on our list of stuff, do you want to just go kind of in order, or do you want to go?
Dealer's choice. Feel
Okay.
free.
Well,
Whatever interests you the most.
let's start with the first one, just right at the top, which was interfaces, because I'm always amazed at how many people that I know and work with who do game development or even just regular C sharp programming for a very long time without learning about interfaces and what they are and why they exist. Um, I don't know if you've seen the same scenario or situation with other people.
Yeah, I've noticed there's nothing about Unity's architecture that makes you need to learn interfaces because by nature of the component model, you kind of get what interfaces are for as a feature set. You know what I mean? You can compose components rather than using any kind of polymorphism or advanced design architecture because you get the same level of kind of composability. So I guess there's not a lot of need initially, unless you know architecture well enough to know why you should be using interfaces. You can kind of get away without learning them. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense because yeah, you could build a game and never touch an interface and still have it all work. You're just losing power that you don't know that you're losing, I guess.
Mm.
Right. So it's
Yeah, they're a complicated topic. I often find even people who know programming a lot. So from my perspective, I kind of see it as um, there's there's sort of software as a service developers, people who have a background in web architecture or building desktop apps, and then there's sort of game developers, and the path you take is very different. So you'll learn different things. And I've noticed even the people who learn through the software development side of web development and sort of desktop applications still don't really use interfaces to their full strength, and even the ones who do don't really know how they work or what they're for. So yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too is just because if you're not taking advantage of it, it's very a lot of the time. I guess what I've seen people do is they get introduced to interfaces. If they learn a little bit about it, they find out what they are, and then they go just slap interfaces on top of every class, and
Yeah,
then use that interface instead of the concrete class definition or declaration. But they never do anything beyond that. So that all they're doing is adding on extra cruft and code that they're
that,
not actually
yeah,
taking advantage of, just because
that's
they
one of those
don't
things.
know.
That's one of those things too that a lot of people don't realize this. When you've been a programming tutor or trainer, you can tell someone's level of development based on some of the tips, some of the things they do. And one of the biggest ones is misuse of interfaces. If I see someone is using interfaces incorrectly by just applying them to every class and using them one interface to match one class, it means they've gotten to the stage they want to learn about architecture. They've picked up a few books or courses, but they don't understand them and they're sort of applying the rules they see other people doing and they're not really learning the underlying mechanics. So it's
Yeah,
really funny. Whenever I see misuse of interfaces, I get a very strong sense of almost exactly where they are in terms of learning programming.
yeah, that's it's funny because that's pretty much what happened to me. Right? Same thing. Like I was like, oh, cool. This felt like the first couple months, like I don't know what I'm doing with these, but it
Yeah.
seems neat. Like trying to figure out how to get the value out of them, and then slowly
Yeah.
realizing how to
That
set
was
them
me in
up.
design patterns. I used factory pattern in every single project to the day I learned about it. I was like, everything's factories. Factories for all the things. I need to create things, so everything needs a factory.
That's hilarious. So I do the same for a lot of different patterns. I think a lot of us do. Like we figure out a new pattern or a new system and just start doing it nonstop. Do you want to? I don't mean to just push this onto you, but do you want to briefly explain what an interface is, or
Sure.
I can,
So
if you.
I I think what's interesting is a lot of people misunderstand what it is. So the naive answer is an interface is a it's a contract for a set of behaviors. So it's a promise to be able to do something. So for example, you might say a chef is able to make food. The contract between you and a chef is you ask for food, you get food. How it happens, how it's prepared, what methods they use, that's all nothing to do with you. The contract between you and them is give money, get food. That's the contract. So what you can do is you can start describing your application in these forms of contracts. So you say, this thing is damageable. I know nothing else about it, but it can take damage. This thing can be healed. So I can give it health and I can check its health and then I can take health from it. And that's all I know about it. And that could be a person and that could be ticking down their health value, or it could be a crate and it could be losing actual bricks or off a wall or anything. It could be, it doesn't matter to you as long as it understands the contract between you. So it's a way of describing applications so things can apply across the board. So a single concept like damageable can apply to everything from a health system all the way to a wall or a painting or an emotion. It doesn't matter. As long as it can be damaged, you can apply the damaged interface to it.
Right. Yeah. It seems like a good description. And then I guess when you're talking about that, one of the you do have to implement it on each of the different things, all right? So like when you set it up, you're saying that it does it, but how it does it is completely
Mhm.
independent, or it's different for each object. Like I guess
Yeah. So
kind
an example I used before, which I quite liked, was imagine I made an interface called navigatable, and you can go up, down, left, right. So it promises whatever the object is, it can go up, down, left, and right. You
okay,
can put that interface on a character, and they can walk forward, back, left, and right. You can put that interface on a menu, and maybe you can navigate the screens forward, back, and then up and down the items. Or you could put that interface on a audio system, and you can switch tracks back and forth and change the volume up and down. All you're promising is whatever this thing is, it knows how to receive an up, a down, a left, and a right. And that's it. And so what it does is irrelevant to you.
yeah, kind of decouple all that. Well, it's a good explanation. I was gonna pull up a quick code example of it, but then I realized I just updated Rider, and none of my projects will open without opening Unity first. It's interesting, but speaking of, you want to talk briefly about the difference between an interface and an abstract class? Because I didn't even mention abstract classes on or in our doc we were talking about, but I think that
That is,
that's
yeah,
they
that's a
go
particular
together so
interesting
well.
subject.
But
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I think my internet's dropping a little bit.
uh
Okay, it should be okay. So yes, interface and abstract class. So this is actually, I don't know if you actually know this story yourself, so you might find this one interesting. So the language we program in Unity is C sharp. And a lot of people don't realize that C sharp as a language was built as a way to compete with Java, which was the current forerunner for a language. People don't often think about languages as products, but they are. They're trying to sell you on using their platform. And so a lot of the decisions in C sharp came from decisions that were in Java. And one of them is the interface. So, interesting fact, not many languages have something called an interface. They actually mostly, when they refer to interfaces, they mean an interface to something, which is an abstraction. It could be an abstract class. An interface as a keyword is very specifically a Java and then a C sharp feature. So, what's particularly interesting about that is they're actually kind of the same thing. The difference practically is that you can put implementation into an abstract class. So you can say up, down, left, right, but by default, up takes a position and moves it up. You can give it sort of a basic feature set that can be changed out. But an interface is just the contract with no implementation. And the only reason it exists is because there's something called the deadly diamond problem. And that's where you try to implement multiple abstract classes that have behaviors. Which one do you pick? So if you have an animal that's inherited by a dog, animal inherited by a canine, and then that canine and dog inherit something else, which one do you pick? Do you pick the route that came this way or the one that came this way? And that's kind of why we have interfaces, so that it's a way of defining that there is a behavior without saying what the behavior is, which is only there to solve this thing called the diamond problem. So yeah, they're basically the same thing, except for the fact that in C sharp specifically, you have an interface which is no implementation, and then an abstract class which does have an implementation. So yeah,
yeah.
that's a very long-winded explanation.
And then, yeah, while they're on that, they're adding default implementations to interfaces. Last I
They
heard,
are indeed, yeah.
which is
So they're finally coming around to most other languages.
yeah, which would be interesting. I mean, I could see an argument for it in some cases. I'm just not sure that it's something that I don't know.
Yeah,
Watch,
it's one of
I'll end
those.
up using it all the
It's rife
time or
for
something.
abuse. That's the problem, right? It's one of those things where it's a cool feature if you use it right, but it can do a lot of confusing things if you use it wrong.
Yeah, sorry if the stream's lagging out a little bit. It was because I accidentally opened up a Unity project in the background, and it is telling me to hold on and probably slowing everything down, which is terrible. Um, I'd kill it if I could. Actually, maybe I can. Let me see if I can find it real quick and just make that thing die. Okay, there we go. Hopefully that stops any lag. Okay, yeah. So that's it. How often do you think you use abstract classes versus
Um,
interfaces, or both? I guess I'm just kind of curious, like
yeah,
day
I
to
use
day.
interfaces a lot. In fact, sometimes I will skeleton out design by interface, so design by contract.
Yeah.
So I will say, when forward input move and receive a vector of up, and I haven't defined where that input came from or what's moving, I can write my code with the assumption that those things will be filled out later. And so I can work in almost interface space, so to speak. And I do that quite often. When it comes to abstract classes, it normally goes the other way around, where I start with, I have three implementations. I've already created a NPC, and he's got one of them flies, one of them walks, or one of them does something else. And then I will say, well, I've noticed most of these predominantly walk, so I might extract an abstract class out and provide a base feature from that. But I find that I would say I would use interfaces consistently across the board, but I don't use abstract classes unless I've made 3 to 4 of identical things that all have some fairly common behaviors.
Yeah, and you're sure that you're not going to need to diverge them more later, right? Like where
Yeah.
you're going to need to have some other bit of shared stuff that's only shared between another subset of them, right?
Oh, another good use as well I find is sometimes you'll do something where there's helper functions that you want on an object, but you don't want to declare them every single time, and you don't want to have to explain where they come from or how they work. So what I might do, for example, is if I was doing a validator. So say you had a grid and you say you can't be outside the grid, you must be in a valid space, or a helper function that would say take a vector 3 and conform it to a grid square. I might put those in an abstract base class so that if I made a simple grid or a 3D grid or a hex grid, they could all extend from grid, and then I could do things like conform to grid or round values to grid, and these will always exist on the base class, and that way they all get that feature without having to redeclare them or re-explain them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good use. Trying to think of, I was going to pull up some example uses that I had, but it was killing the stream trying to open up that Unity project. I just upgraded Writer this morning, so it wants to redo everything. But yeah, I was thinking about abstract classes that I've got are recently in some UI elements. Like very simple stuff, though. It handles like clicking and sending a message and
Mm.
spreading that message around, or yeah, dragging. It's clicking and dragging, right? Clicking and dragging of UI elements for inventory and abilities and stuff.
Yeah,
The
yeah. I
the
find
last one.
equip is one of the most common sort of. You need something to equip something else. That's a very good candidate for sort of these sorts of repeatable functions.
Yeah, yeah, it's good stuff. Well, yeah, hopefully that's helpful for everybody. Just remember that you use a lot more interfaces than abstract classes. You'll use abstract classes somewhat rarely. When you find that you're implementing the same thing over and over on all of your implementations of an interface or part of an interface, then it's often a good time to consider an abstract class. Not
Mm.
necessarily jump into one, but consider it at least, just because you do lose that flexibility of being able to inherit along the way.
It's like luggage, right? Like think of it as if you're using an abstract class, you're bringing all of that luggage to the next class you're using. And sometimes that's good. You want to sort of have a preset template of previous behavior. But if you ask yourself, oh, hang on a second, I don't need half the things in this abstract class when I copy it, maybe
Yeah.
either they shouldn't be in the abstract class or maybe your abstract class does too many things. So that's usually a good spot. If you find yourself going, why do I have all of these features inherited that I'm not actually using?
Right. Yeah. If you're only using 1 out of 4, then it's probably not the way to go. I would say. You should probably be using almost all of them.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. What else did we have? We had a big list of stuff. You want to go just down the list to events, or is there something else that's more interesting on
Well,
here?
someone was asking about when to use attributes.
Oh,
So I
okay.
don't.
Attributes was on our list, so yeah, let's
Yeah,
hit
that's
it.
a fun one. Well, you go first this time. When do you actually use many attributes? I don't think I asked you.
So it it depends because for to use attributes, I have to expose things in the inspector, and depending on the project, the amount of stuff expose in the inspector varies dramatically. So with
Mm.
the current project that I spend the most time on is an MMO, and I do almost zero inspector exposing stuff. Like designers just aren't in the editor putting in content, right? They're using some more custom tools and custom placement stuff. There's still a little bit of inspector stuff, and there's a lot for the artist team. Like, so we'll do like special inspector tools for them, or even some of the artists will even do their own. And then those might have attributes. But when I'm working on other projects that are like smaller, so I've got a team where the designers can actually work in the editor, right? Basically, like a non MMO, right? Because MMOs are so different because all the data is just in a
Yeah,
database.
that must be tough trying to explain topics when an MMO is a very specific case, and
Yeah,
so a lot of the references don't really apply, or at least if they do, they apply in very specific ways.
yeah, and they don't apply very much at all for MMOs, or at least not nearly as much, just because you're doing so much of the stuff just directly in a database, and you're having to build custom tools for like spawning these NPCs. You just can't have you can't have a team of designers in editing some scene, placing down NPCs, right,
Yeah.
and like
Even
saving
Unity
stuff
scenes
off.
in general, I don't like having multiple people on one scene at all. If I can avoid it, I always try to get people to work in a separate project and then
Yep.
import in Unity packages. It's just not worth the chaos whenever Unity tries to merge two scenes.
Yeah, getting that merged would be a nightmare, and then getting that data out to development servers and stuff would have a big pipeline turnaround. So I like to set it up so that designers can just go in, run around in a tool. Now we've got a new tool. Guy named Rob built. It's really cool. It actually uses the Unity editor and then syncs up to the database, and then you can use the editor tools to place everything, and
Oh, nice.
it saves all the stuff off in the data. And he's built some custom inspectors in that, but most of the other stuff just doesn't have that because we're not using so much of that workflow. But it is really good for that. But what I'm saying is, in the smaller projects where I've worked with just like 2 or 3 designers, and everybody's working in Unity, doing mobile stuff, VR stuff, or just PC stuff. I do a ton of custom inspectors, and the main reason is just to avoid designers having to ask me what a thing does, and me
Mm,
having to go look it up, because
yeah,
if they
yeah,
have to ask, it means it's not obvious, and then it may not be obvious to me, so I got to go look it up. And then all of our like the turnaround time from them figuring out what setting to use and actually using the setting goes from 5 seconds to 10 minutes or 20 minutes, and digging into my time and distracting from other things getting done. So I put in
yeah,
a ton of those, some of the ones that we talked about earlier, like the default ranges, so that they know
yeah.
what values to go with. They're going to be in between some version. Oh, Windows 10, it really wants me to restart. Um, or the tooltips. Tooltips are huge. Right? I love
Mm.
putting those in for the serialized field, so they know exactly what it does, and I'll put in enough description so that if I'm looking at it, I know what it does too. Right? Like
Yeah,
I
because
want it
that's
to be
that's a
clear.
massively underestimated thing is that the amount of times you as a developer will make something and then move on and make something else. And then you're going to have to look back at your own code a week, a month, a year from now and go, what did this do again? Why did I call it range value? What does that do? So
Yeah.
sometimes being very explicit and using tooltips and things are not just because they're nice. Sometimes you need them looking back at your own projects.
Yeah, they save me all the time, right? Just so I know that, and naming things well. I was
Mm.
talking in, I think it was the stream last week or something, about the method that was the set state method that I renamed. I think I might have renamed that live on the stream. Just terribly named method, totally screwed me. Because it
One of
was
my
an
favorites,
increment state, not set state.
yeah, no, that can be confusing. The
Yeah,
verb is often really important too, right? And
yeah,
that's why, without putting too fine a point on it, the correct kind of fancy name for methods are actually split into two categories. They're called accessors and mutators, and that's where you're used to seeing get name, get age, get health. These are called accessors because the implication is they give you a value, they do not change values.
yeah.
And if a get method changes something, you're probably doing something wrong because you're breaking what's called a rule of expectation, which means someone thinks something's going to happen and something else does, and that leads to weird side effects. So you try to keep those two things separate: things that get stuff and things that change stuff. Another word for that when you get to databases is called command query separation, but it basically boils down to get stuff, do stuff, try not to have things that do both.
Yep. And that's one of the reasons I hate getter properties that do things secretly, that do anything that other than reading data, right? That
Yeah, you can calculate a read field maybe, but even then, I prefer to cache it if I'm doing that.
that's fine. If it's just like combining first name and last name and caching that and returning it. It's the ones that
Mm.
go do like a database call,
Yeah.
right? Or you get it and it sets something on the UI. Like what the hell?
Yeah, yeah. Or you call get and all of a sudden there's a huge lag and you're like, what's happening? Oh yeah, it's going and calculating and then building object trees or something
Yeah.
insane. Yeah, yeah.
Yep, doing some big heavy process every time you try to access get on a property is worst.
One thing you made a good point earlier when you mentioned the range fields to give default values for designers. Um, there's a great term. I forgot who told me this, but it really stuck with me. There's a term called batteries included, and it means if I give you my script and I'm not there to explain it, in ideal circumstances, you could place it on an object, press play, and it does something. Maybe not the ideal version of what you want, but it doesn't break. It doesn't require you to set very specific values. The default expectation is it should work to give you a good sense of what it does, and then the value ranges should be within safe ranges that it always does something relative to what you want. So I always try to make sure that every script I give somebody has a default best case scenario, try to work kind of state. So I always go for that. And then the range values are sort of, you shouldn't ever realistically go beyond this value. Worst case, open my script, change the default values, but I'm trying to give you a best effort of what the most likely ranges would be, you know?
Yeah, I like that. It's a good rule. Someone mentioning that singleton instance property breaks that rule of the. I guess it kind of does, but it's really doing that caching. But I don't.
Mm,
It does break that rule, which kind of
yeah.
yeah. You're not wrong there. Okay, well, should we just let's see. What other attributes do you use? I guess let's talk a little bit more about them. So I mentioned range and tooltip. Those are the two that
Range
I use
tooltip.
the most.
I
But
use a lot of header and then space just because I really like to see things clean. So what space does is if you put the space attribute above something, all it does is put a line gap in the editor. It seems like overkill in the editor to do that. But if you've ever had a load of fields together and then you put headers on a few of them, even the headers look a bit squished. So putting a little space beside the headers and give you a nice separation, and you can very clearly define out these are the fields to do with audio, these are the fields to do with setting position and so on, you know?
yeah, I like that too. Just doing the headers to group stuff out. What other are there any other
Oh,
ones that you use a
color. Have
lot?
you used that one?
Which
There is
one?
an attribute for color if you have a color field
Oh,
where
okay.
you can provide extra values like the ability to do HDRP and high range colors. So that
I
one's quite
vaguely
valuable if
remember
you're
that.
doing some nice the new render pipeline stuff. You want to be able to set your colors into really high, bright ranges.
That's right. Or to be able to turn on alpha.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's another
thanks
one.
for the super chats, by the way, guys. I just saw a second one. Looks like it came in. I didn't miss the first one.
Then
Oh,
there's some that aren't native that I tend to make a lot. I usually like making a read-only attribute and a button attribute. Now I know you can use something like Odin or you can build your own inspectors, but sometimes you just want a really quick one. I do find though less than I use the button, I would normally use context menu. That's a good question. Do you
oh.
use context menu very often in your scripts?
I wouldn't say often, but when I'm stuck in debugging something is when I tend to use context menu.
Hmm.
When I cannot figure out what the hell is going on and I just want to run some code real quickly at runtime and step through it because I'm running out of ideas. So then I'm like, okay, let's put in a context menu. For anybody that doesn't know it, you put it above a method and then you can run that method. So you can basically like right click in the inspector and then run that little chunk of code anytime you want when you're playing. Actually, I think you can even do it in edit mode, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll run in edit mode.
It'll cause errors obviously if the objects don't initialize. So you have to make sure that you have objects initialized or it's static. But yeah, it
Yeah.
does work in the editor.
Um, but yeah, I use it for that. Do you have other uses that you use it for?
I use it mostly for prototyping. So what I'll do is my cycle of building a system is I'm I'm a big fan of kind of taking that mentality of make it work, make it good, and then make it clean. And so the idea being that I will write the simplest code I can to make something just just hack and sort of kind of work. And I'll put a context menu attribute over it so I can test it in the editor. And then when it works, I will then make some running script that will run it, and I will then remove that attribute. And then I sort of work my way towards cleaner architecture. But when I'm testing, I like to be able to just right click a bunch of scripts in the editor and just run stuff really quickly without having to go and like if input mouse click check that. I just want to just quickly test it while I'm cycling.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's what unit tests should be doing, though.
Yeah, it should actually. That brings up another a good topic of conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, one other attribute someone brought up that's quite good as well is the required component attribute.
Oh, yeah. That one I use a lot. I forgot
Yeah,
about that. You want to explain it?
that one's pretty good. Yeah, okay. So required component. Now this is an interesting one. If you put the required component attribute above a script, you can say there's another component that this thing needs. So basically, if you're going to call get component in a script, you are already making the assumption that that script exists on the same object. So if you put a required component, you're being very explicit about that. And so if you add it, it'll automatically add those extra scripts for you. For example, if you have some sort of physics throwing script and you need the object to have a rigid body, then when you put the required component rigid body, the minute you put your script on, it automatically adds a rigid body if it's not there. But the caveat is if you're writing the script and it's already on the object and you put the required component attribute on it, it will not add it retroactively. So you have to make sure that you're putting it on beforehand or that you add the object yourself in that case.
Yep. I don't know if you've run into this problem, but it's happened to me at least a couple times where I had the require component on there and I was messing with prefabs and suddenly I had two of the same component on there.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Like it added the component on again accidentally. And I assume it's probably just me being in betas constantly that triggers that. But it's something to just watch out for when you do use require component. You may.
Also, the opposite's true as well, which gets really frustrating. It's when you've got a bunch of scripts where you've tried to be really clever and have require components in them, and then you try to take one off, and it's like, oh, well, I need that one. Oh, well, I need that script, and all of a sudden you can't remove the script from the object
Because
it's got some insane hierarchy of dependencies. Yeah.
Yeah, make sure that if you're going to require it, it's an actual dependency. So that you're not just adding it for fun or to auto add things. Like it should be a real dependency that your thing needs to work. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, you want to talk real quickly about testing?
Yep, that's a good point. So I guess I'll start asking you first. Is how often would you start by testing? So would you test before you begin writing code and go test driven, or do you test as you write features in Unity?
I kind of go back and forth now. I do a little bit of test driven where I just do it test first, and mostly just to get better at it. I think ideally I'd like to do test driven stuff the majority of the time. But
It feels
I
right,
need to
doesn't it?
get
It feels like the thing you should be doing, but it's very hard to get into the habit of doing it.
yeah, I just feel like I need to get a little bit faster at it, right? Like I can do it, I can get it. And to be honest, like I don't feel like I'm actually going any slower. It just feels like it's easier to get mixed up and lost in what I'm doing. I don't know, but I'd say I don't do enough just directly test driven. Instead, a lot of the time, probably the majority of the time, I'm writing the features, and then once I have them kind of figured out and mostly working, I'll start writing the tests around it to test all of the assumptions that I have on the code, like what I expect it to do, what it should be doing, what I think it's doing. Sometimes I'm wrong and like I'm seeing something on the screen that's not the actual behavior because I'm just blind to it. One that popped up recently was like with this spell book. So it's like just a thing of like standard MMO spell book, right? And you can go through pages page by page and look at your different spells. You just scroll through the mouse wheel or a button or whatever. And normally you would expect like it's got 24 slots, so I got 25 abilities. You expect the first ability on page 2 to be like number 25, right? So I write a test for that. Like, hey, this ability, page 2, I should have this ability there. Found out I was actually getting number 24 on there, so I was constantly having the previous one there. And I'd scrolled through it a dozen times. Lots of people had looked at it, and nobody had noticed, right? Like, just one of those things like a test spelling out the actual behavior was the one thing that made it really get exposed and show up. So that was kind of an interesting one. But that's usually kind of my current habit. Although, like I said, I'm working on switching to as much TDD as possible, just because I
Mm,
feel like I end up with better coverage, and I think it in the long run just speeds me up because I'm not having to go back and deal with bugs and issues. We'll see. I don't know. We'll see how it is like 6 months from now if I still feel the same way.
mm. I'll admit I don't test driven development features that are predominantly going to live in Unity. I find that if I've got something which can be a standalone component or feature, and I can write business rules down that don't have any dependencies on Unity, I see that as an immediate good candidate to do test driven development. So, for example, if I needed a health system, I can write down a bunch of rules. And I use the term business rules because it comes
Yeah.
from that sort of business mentality, but it effectively means if I do this, will this happen kind of thing. And so with the health system, without even talking about Unity or game engines, I can write down if take damage, health is less. If damage is puts the health into zero range or less than zero, it should be only at zero and clamped. If I try to heal and it goes greater than max health, it should stay at max health. I can write these rules down, I can test them, and I can implement them and prove they work without ever really dealing with components or mono behaviors or anything. And I can make that system and then drop it in as a DLL into Unity, and I've got a really robust and tested system. I'll do that a lot, but I don't find myself testing things that live in Unity just because trying to extract out behaviors and sort of inject lighter weight versions. The humble object, as I think you made a video on that. I try doing that, but I find there's just something about the Unity architecture that when I'm in Unity, I will lean into the way Unity wants me to do things. But if I can take something out of Unity, I will do it my way outside of Unity. I try to kind of keep those two separate and then just sort of use them when I have to, you know?
Yeah. And I think before doing testing of Unity objects used to be really, really hard. But I was surprised when I got back into it. I don't know, like a
Mm,
year ago, how much easier it had gotten. Like, actually, just create. So when I'm testing, I do the same. I would say a lot of the testing I do is around non-game object stuff, right? It's non-Unity. If some of it uses Unity specific stuff like vectors, in their vector class, but there's not a lot that's or a lot of the tests are just testing basic logic that aren't on components, I guess is the point. But there's
mm,
testing actual game objects has gotten quite a bit easier to actually just spawn up a prefab or set up test scenes that have these objects in them and then get a reference to them, do the tests on them. You don't. I like that you don't have to go into the editor and do all of the weird wacky setup that you
mm.
used to have to do. Right? It was like a whole
I
custom
admit,
tool.
I have seen those tools. I have seen that there's some really nice ways to do um, the play mode testing. I've
Mhm.
just not looked into it yet, so I guess that's probably more my fault than anything else. I'd say I think the features are robust enough to start doing it, but it's just a habit I'll have to get into. And I've been doing
Yeah.
it the way I have been doing it for 10, 12 years that it's going to be very hard to go back and try to
No,
kind of get into the
I
Unity
feel the
way.
same way. And then like I said, when I first tried it, it was crazy. But they've simplified it down to where it feels like you're just writing a unit test and you just instantiate a game object. You just create the thing or spawn the prefab, and then run the test against it. But one thing I like about doing it that way, or with test scenes even better, is that I can actually test multiple game object interactions. So it's more like an integration test than just
Yeah.
a flat out unit test where I can test that like, hey, if the player clicks here, like we're getting the actual behavior, and this object is passing off this data to the other object, and the whole pipeline is working, not just the one point. Because I mean, it's easy with unit tests to write a bunch of unit tests, have them all pass, and have your game not actually work, right? Like
Yeah.
I've seen
Yeah.
that plenty of times. But with the integration tests actually going through, and they're still called unit tests, but the play mode tests, um, you can get a lot more, I think, reliability and knowing whether
Mm,
or not something broke because you're testing a lot of components together. Or you can still mock them out with using n substitute and interfaces for them and just kind of like mock in the different components or
yeah.
game object references. But what I've found myself doing recently is just spawning as many of them or setting up a test scene. Like if I want to test UI stuff, I'll set up a UI test scene that has the actual components I'm going to use, and does validation on all of those too. Um,
Yeah, I'll admit that's dirty little secret. Is as much as I write tests and I'll try to maintain behavior, I will almost always write something tester or something helper just so I can drag an object in call a mouse click or call a component context menu, just so at least once or twice I can see it running in the editor when I click a button and check if the behavior is what I want. It's
Yeah.
probably paranoia more than anything else, but I think a lifetime of doing this, the same as you, is you just want to see it in a practical example and not just be certain that the tests have turned green, because we've
Yeah.
all been there where you've got good code coverage, but it's not really guaranteeing it's going to work.
Right. Yeah. I want to be able to slow the tests down and actually watch it run. Like, let me see you click on it. Let me see the item pop on. Let me see
Yeah,
the item
yeah,
move. You see the rocket go flying or whatever.
yeah.
And writing tests is, I don't know. It's one of those things that feels like a giant waste of time, I guess, when you start off. It's really weird. But then when you start to see the payoff, when you start to have hundreds of them and you start to see, like, oh, I made this little change to fix something and I accidentally broke something else, and I would have committed that because there's no way I would have thought to go check that. That's when the payoff comes. And it's much, much
Yeah.
later.
And the
Like,
other
well,
problem too is you're right in saying that when people say starting doing tests is a waste, feels like a waste of time. Well, the unfortunate truth is often it is a waste of time, because if you don't know how to write good tests, you could be wasting your time. You could
yeah.
just be testing pointless things that are sort of, does object exist that I just created? Yes. Is the string field null when I set it to null? Is it a name when I set it to a name? These don't really tell you anything and they don't really help you. And so learning how to write tests that are valuable is a skill in and of itself. And so a lot of people are put off tests, doing unit tests, because they start by not learning how to do it right. They start doing it, see no value, think it's useless, and then feel like they've wasted time. So trying to learn how to do it correctly is probably a very important part of that process.
I think you're 100% on there. It's easy to just go in and I think I remember doing this when I first started, right? Like, you just start testing all of the base core framework stuff. Well, like, I'm going to write tests to make sure, like I said, that
Yeah.
setting a string set the string to the right
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Like,
Like you
it
do
was
50
a,
tests to ensure every variant of string. Well, what happens if it's null? What happens if it's too short? What happens if it's too
yeah.
long? It's like pointless, just a waste of your time.
Yeah, that's where I think the TDD mantra comes in well, when you just write enough to make the test fail, then write enough to make the test pass in code, and then continue on. Just going that back and forth.
Red,
Um,
green, refactor.
yeah,
Yeah.
and just constantly having a thing that you're testing, not just trying to write tests to increase the number. Yeah, I don't know. Tests are fun. I like them now. I used to hate them. I used to think they were weird, and that
I
people
will
that wrote
say that
tests were weird.
the
Now I
most
love it.
satisfying moment is not just when you have good tests, but as you pointed out, there's that moment where you get value out of it. And one of my favorite moments was I was working on a system and I had to refactor it, and I ended up having this giant test suite. And so I changed a couple of lines and a bunch of tests turned red, because another thing later on, you can use things for continuous test runners. So effectively, the tests are being run live as you change the code. They're very cool. You can actually see when I press a key on my keyboard and tests break. And once you've got that real time feedback of things, refactoring your code becomes really, really fun and easy.
Yeah,
Because there's a thing that Bob Martin said, which is that the problem with code is that as it grows, people get afraid to edit it, because even if you didn't write it, if you change code and it breaks, you own it now. You've just taken ownership of the code because you broke it. So people are afraid to even refactor bad code into good code because they don't want to take on the responsibility of code that looks bad or that they didn't write. But if you have a test suite, you don't feel that fear anymore, because you can make a change. Oh, tests are still good. Make a change, tests, and you end up feeling that confidence that you can actually make code better without worrying. And that's a really freeing feeling on a big system.
yeah, I totally agree. And Bob Martin's one that convinced me too, without a doubt. That's funny. Yeah, I like those constant tools too. I was using one for a while, but not inside Unity. I forget
Ncrunch,
why.
maybe?
What's that?
Was it Ncrunch?
Yes, it was nCrunch. Yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah. I
used to
was.
use Ncrunch until the JetBrains team ended up adding their own. So now it became part of ReSharper, and now it's became part of ReSharper, and now it's in Writer. So I just use the Writer version.
Oh, okay. I didn't know it was in Writer. I'm gonna have to
Yeah.
figure that out and try it out. Okay. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really
it's really
nice
good.
because it's just, yeah, it constantly runs your tests. Does it only run edit mode tests?
Uh, I don't know. Good question.
Okay, I'll have to try it out. I'll be curious. Either way, I think it's awesome. There
Mm.
was a super chat that came in too. And oh, okay, it's actually, I don't know if you saw it. So he's asking about came from a React.js development environment, and diving into the scriptable object architecture and wanted to know if it's still a viable choice because it resembles component slash modular approach that he likes from React. And I have to admit, my React experience is very minor. It had been in
Um,
Angular, very, very little React. So I'm not super
yeah, see,
familiar
I'd be
with
the
it.
same as you. I have a lot of experience with Angular and Angular 2. I barely got started with React, but I will say Angular 2 via TypeScript does look very similar to the React workflow. Not if you're doing it the JavaScript way, but if you're doing it the component model with TypeScript, it is. It's very similar. Um, and I guess my opinion on that would be, I guess, if the question is it a viable choice? Pretty much everything's a viable choice. I know that's not very satisfying. You can make most things work. As for whether it's the right thing to do, like that's a very hard question to ask, given that it really depends on your project. But I find I've had this discussion before, and for me, I see scriptable objects as configuration data, and I try not to use them too much in the way, for example, the Ryan Hipple talk. That's the one that everyone's famous for pointing
Yeah.
out that he used the events in scriptable objects. It's really cool, and I've done that before for testing things and for prototyping. You can do some really fast prototyping, but I try not to use scriptable objects for anything other than configuration data in a more practical production sense.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat, but do you want to explain why? Why you feel that way?
Well, well, firstly, mostly because anytime I can avoid having a dependency I don't need, I prefer that. And with scriptable objects in particular, it still hooks into the Unity lifecycle, and I don't need most of that if it's a persistence thing. If I'm using it literally as a storage, I can save to a file or use a local MySQL database, and I can get all the same features without having to have this sort of lifecycle object. But I also find a lot of people aren't aware of how scriptable object functions. And what I mean by that is a scriptable object that you edit when in the editor will save your changes. But when you make a build, it'll keep the values that you had at build time. And then when you change it as the game is running, it'll revert back to the build time changes. So this can be confusing, and it can also just be one of those scenarios where you think of it like you're having some saved data files, but they're not saved data. They are literally configuration and data. And if you want to use them in that kind of a way, you still have to persist out with some kind of serialization tool. You're still going to have to save to a JSON file or something, and then on a wake, read that file back and then change the values. And I'm not saying you can't do that. And there are cases where it's very handy to have this persistent in memory cross scene file. It's very good for that. Um, but it's not the architecture it was built for. It's not meant to like be your entire backend saving system. And I find it's stretching what it's meant for to the point where you start to see seams and issues. So personally, I don't want to hit those weird edge cases. I would rather use the tool for basically what it's built for. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking the biggest thing that I have against him, and I mean I understand the use for him. I guess let's just briefly talk about when that scenario comes in useful. So like in that video, he's showing a system where designers can go in and customize and almost make a new game or game mode out of their games, right?
Mm.
So they have like this base
Oh, good
library
point. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know where
where
you're going
like
with this.
designers can come in, like they can totally change it. They can make a different themed version of the game that has totally different stats and different abilities and pools and stuff, but they're all still following kind of the same majority of the same set of rules, right? It's the same kind of game you're building. It's like if you're building a solitary game, this kind of tool set could come in really handy because you can build 50 different solitary games, and if you're releasing one every month or one every 3 weeks or whatever the schedule is on those, it's super helpful because you don't need code to go in there and make these changes, right? You want to go like, hey, this is magic, so he's got fire and cold, and this one's sci-fi, so we're changing all these things, and now it's 3 tech things instead of 5 magic things, and they hook up to different elements slightly differently. I think it's super powerful there because then you can save a ton of time, money, and energy on code. Like you just have a smaller
Mm.
code team and a much bigger creative design team that will cost you less and you can iterate a lot faster. But if you're just building one game, it's like Jason said, you're just kind of adding extra complexity and extra layers of stuff that you probably don't need and you can probably accomplish in much easier, less complicated ways. And you don't have to constantly, as a programmer, go into the inspector and look at how things are wired up and how things are getting called. Because as a an experienced programmer is usually going to want to use the code IDE and just dive around and bounce through the code really quickly, looking at references and where things are called, and not have to go in and open scenes and prefabs, click on them, see what they're linked to, what code that's calling. It just slows that process down a lot, and I think adds a lot of extra complexity that if you're not going to take advantage of the reuse and the constant customization, then it's just not worth it. But if you are going to
Yeah.
do that, then it's something to look into. But I would probably not do it as a starting point. I would build the game first and then look and say, hey, okay, well, we're looking at doing, 3 different versions of this or 10 versions, or we're going to keep pumping out versions or small iterations. Then maybe look at popping that in.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't just
See,
go to
I
it by
have a
default.
that's a point I completely missed that I forgot to mention that you brought up, which is here's a rule I follow that I kind of do this subconsciously, but it's something to really keep in mind. So I'm going to keep harping on the phrase business rules because in my mind that's what software is. The point is you're not sitting down for no reason. You're sitting down because you have a goal in mind, right? I want to fire my gun. I want to collect a collectible. There's a rule. You can say when I walk into a collectible, I pick it up. There's a rule in your mind. And so the thing that Jason's alluding to there is you can get to the point where you build an architecture that's so clever, you can connect things together to build business rules. And this is the little asterisk I want to be careful on, which is whenever I have a business rule in my application, something I can describe to somebody, I want to walk over and when I pick this up, my health goes up. That's my business rule. Or when I, level up, my health goes up by 10. These are business rules. And I want to be able to point to where that is in my application. Either it's in a configuration text file, either it's in a line of code or it's some system or something. I need to be able to say, here's the rule in my head, that's where it lives. And if you get to the point where your architecture's rules live in the interconnection of objects, then if something goes wrong, 2 objects get disconnected or some field nulls out and someone's like, wait, what went here again? You've lost that business rule. Your rule lived in the connection between the objects. It didn't live in the objects. So for me, to be very explicit, I don't like putting business rules in this nebulous middle ground between 2 objects. I like to put the rules in objects and then use the connections to trigger rules into other rules. But that's very different than putting the rule in this sort of interconnected space that can get lost if things break. So yeah, that's a very dangerous thing that I've seen happen. Entire games built on the interconnections of object rules in really confusing ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation too, and just kind of covers it, like why you wouldn't do
Mm.
it. Yeah. So in general, I guess the answer would be just don't
Yeah,
don't
I
don't
guess.
default to that. I wouldn't just jump to that because it looks nice and it looks like it makes things easier. It'll make some things a little bit easier, but it's going to make everything else, I'd say, a lot more complicated. That was a good one. Did you see anything in chat that you wanted to talk about before we dive on to whatever we hit next? I
It
don't know
seems
if
like
there's
everyone's
any.
having their own fun conversation, so nothing's really jumping out at me.
Yeah, seems like there's lots of chat and lots of questions in there, but people are answering the questions, so we don't have to. um. Well, next on our list was just prefabs, which
Mm.
I think is pretty interesting. I assume that most people here know about prefabs, but we'll just talk briefly about the importance of them and when to use them and nesting them. Before we do, though, can you guys all hit the like button real quick and see if we get up over like, I don't know, 100 or 200 or something? That'd be cool. Anyway, yeah, let's talk about prefabs. So,
Mm.
um, that sound like a good one to you? It sounds
Yeah,
good to me.
I think the interesting thing, the first thing they mentioned about prefabs is depending on when you started using Unity, there's a concept now called nested prefabs, and you can kind of do some interesting stuff with it. But before I go down that road, it's funny for people who've been using Unity since like 3 and 4. Nested prefabs have been a feature on the books people have asked for years. That's a feature
Yeah.
that everyone intuitively knew was a good idea, but it just was never there. But yet, I've noticed since it's been added to Unity, people don't use it very often, which is really frustrating because it's one of the most valuable features in the entire thing. But it just doesn't seem to be something people either know about or they don't really understand the value of it.
Yeah. Or I've found sometimes people just feel afraid because they're not like they know prefabs well enough. They know nested prefabs exist, and like some of them like played with it when they were first in beta and kind of buggy and weird, and no, they just aren't very familiar with nested versus variants and how to use them or what to use. So they just use regular old prefabs.
Mm.
Which I think is a big loss because the nesting of prefabs makes it really nice to build some certain types of systems. I guess in general, like when I'm building game objects, I try to keep them relatively flat and like not, I don't like to have tons and tons of arrows that you can expand out, right? So that
Mm.
you have a huge level in your hierarchy beyond like a model and animation stuff. Um, I try to minimize that as much as possible, except in UIs. So nested prefabs for me, the biggest use case for them is in UI stuff. Not just
Like
in UI
list
stuff.
item components and stuff.
What's that?
Like list item components, like those sorts of templates
Yeah,
for
exactly. So
those kinds of, yeah.
templates for different components of stuff. Sometimes those are in there, and then just the UI will be built out of multiple canvases and prefabs, and some of those will be nested underneath. Um, I find that to be pretty useful, and also just for things like particle systems, right? So you want to put
Mm.
a prefabs. You used to before have to basically instantiate the particle system on the prefab, right? Like, or have it in there and then go back and change it constantly. You couldn't have a particle system that was a child of a prefab, like say it's a soccer ball with a little sparkle on it or some crap, right? You wanted to change that, you had to go change it in every single soccer ball prefab that you had, and now you can just have this one little sparkle that follows your ball and change it and modify it, and it updates for all of them because it just references that nested prefab instead of being a particle system under the one prefab. It comes in.
I
Those are the two cases I've used it the most recently, I
I
guess.
actually find there's a third case that people don't realize how powerful it is. It's one that doesn't come up very often. But one of the really cool uses of prefabs is procedurality. And a lot of people don't think about this because when I say prefab, most people assume, okay, I take this tree I like that I've made and it's a certain size and I'm going to reuse this and I'll make a prefab. I now have small tree. That's
Hmm.
my prefab. But what's really cool, a prefab is just a reusable set of components, but you can kind of place multiple ones around. But imagine I had this thing called tree, and it wasn't small tree or big tree or oak tree. It was just tree. And I could place 20 trees around. And then there's a checkbox on the script on that prefab that says randomize. And so on launch, each one of those trees chooses a different one to be. Or I have an object I place on a table called table stuff. And now in each room, some stuff gets spawned on the table. Sometimes it's a coffee mug and a pen. Other time it might be a small computer or laptop or something. And you can build some really cool features out of reusing this conceptual idea of a thing that goes here, but maybe tweak the colors or change the value or pick from one of these textures. So I'll often use a prefab to represent something where it has to conform to these sets of rules, but beyond that point, feel free to have these range of customizable differences just to give a bit of like rotational offsets or something. I don't have to go in and nudge every rock to be 10 degrees lit different. I can just place a bunch of rocks down and say, kind of move a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, makes sense. And you're just talking about standard prefabs, not nesting specifically, right?
No, no, just taking one
Just
prefab and
regular
saying
prefab. Yeah.
be a randomizable prefab. And
Yeah.
what's cool is you don't even have to do that at runtime either. You can use your prefabs to place the objects down and then use some sort of like you can on placing them, you can randomize them and do different things. But there's so many cool ways to use prefabs if you think about it more as a unit of work that can be repeated, not just as like a model that you can reuse, you know?
Yeah. It's not just a piece of art with a sound effect on it. Yeah. It's a good point. So when you do that, just to clarify for everybody out there, you just have a script on there that's doing some randomization and on
Yeah, yeah.
validate or
There'll be a checkbox in the script. Like for example, there might be a single checkbox on a object, and it'll say randomize color, and it'll be off by default. But I could turn it on and then drop 10 of them in the scene and then uncheck it, and that way I can place ones that are very specifically the one I want,
Mhm.
or I can say, you know what, I've got a bunch of cool lights in the background, like fairy lights on a tree or something like that. I don't want to manually go in and make that red and that blue, and I don't want to go in and just there you go. make them interesting for me. And if you wanted to, you could just have a button to re-roll them into different ones. Or there's a million ways you could approach that problem. You know?
Yeah, that seems nice. It seems like a good way to do it and a good use of it. It also kind of reminds me of prefab variants. I mean, it's not obviously there's the randomness isn't there, but the variants
Yeah.
are another more, I guess, strict way of doing something similar, where you can have different variations on the prefab, and then as you change that base prefab, the all the variants modify with it. Which I think
See, I
is
would use that for a painter type solution. If I was building an environment, I would make a basic object and then I would make variants using the prefab variant system. And then I would build like a painter tool that I could drag all of the variants in, choose like weighted values, and then paint them. And that way I'd have the freedom to say, I want the small rock 20% of the time, the moss covered rock 5% of the time, and I can just paint them on and then change it later. And that gives you the freedom of both, right? Because you can then you're not reliant on the randomizer, but you can then use the prefab variants to maintain similarity, but yet still give yourself the freedom to do cool stuff with it, you know?
yeah, it's just pretty handy. I don't know. I also I use them a lot for changing art, where I have a bunch of objects that work the same but just look different. And they just have
Mm.
an art variance in them. Unless there's a case where I can have just a base object and then the art is a child, in which case I'll just go with that, and then the art is just a child prefab instead, because then it's even easier to deal with.
I do that a lot. My personal preference is I put the child. I would take things like colliders and stuff and put them on the parent. Then I
Mhm.
would put the child object under it, remove everything except for the renderer, and I would name it model or something like that.
Yeah.
And then I would use that as my visual representation, so I can swap it out without worrying about it breaking behavior.
Yep, that's generally the way that I like to set up almost all my prefabs. Exactly like that. So that the model is completely independent. And one of the big reasons anybody that's watching and thinks that's crazy is that if you make a change to that model and you want to just swap it in, it's a whole lot easier if that's a child than if it's on
Think
the
about a
base
character
object.
controller. If you move an object in and ever suddenly the colliders change size and everything goes messy, and if you just instead had a visual character, you just size it up and line the feet up correctly, all of a sudden everything still works. You keep all
Yeah.
of the same behavior, no messing. It's so much better.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can even have multiple and swap them. You can do all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
It makes it a lot easier, I think. Just a much better workflow. Let's see. I don't know. I don't know if I have anything else to say about prefabs other than everybody should be
No,
using
they're
them.
good. Use them. Yeah, I think we pretty much covered the
Yeah,
the most
you should
important parts.
understand them and use them. If you find yourself copying objects in a scene, it probably should be a prefab, unless it's
Mm.
like a piece of environment that you're just copying once or something. But in general, like you find yourself making multiple of an object, it should be a prefab. Or if you're spawning it at runtime, it should almost definitely be a prefab.
Mm.
Very few reasons not to be a prefab in that case. Um, let's see. I don't know what we should hit next. Like, there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about on this list.
Yeah, maybe we should ask for some questions for this one rather than us just ranting. I'm sure there's at least one or two. I've seen a few questions pop up a few times. I feel bad for not answering them.
Oh yeah. I don't know. I'll let you pick a question. If you see
Okay, if
one that
anybody has any question, feel free to throw one in chat.
you can hit one or two of those, and maybe my dog will stop barking in the background. I doubt it though. He'll probably keep going at it.
Well, this one it's not quite relevant to Unity, but I think it's worth answering anyway.
Okay.
Is someone said, I'm curious as to why someone would use something like C# for the back end of a game and Java for the networking side. Well, specifically those two languages, it's an odd choice. But this brings up a more interesting topic I want to mention, which is that there's a lot of stuff in software that people conflate as being needed or relevant to each other. So here's the interesting thing. When you're saving out data in a game, for example, I'll often get a question like, how do I save my data to a database? How do I save it to JSON? What's the best way to do it? This, that, and the other. And from my perspective, people consider the format you save in as being precious or important. But what's really interesting about software in general is there's an entire industry in software development, mostly in kind of business and networking side, where it's called interfacing. And it basically means if an application can spit out one format, another application can read in that format, they can sort of talk even if they're not meant to. And so a lot of software in general doesn't really care. So why did I bring that up? Well, the question is, why use C# for one and Java for the other? Well, because it really doesn't matter. And that's what's really interesting. You can write your server in C# or PHP or JavaScript or whatever, as long as you conform to the contract that the other system will take in. And this is a real life example of interfaces. That's what it is. It is a contract between two things that, as long as they talk the same language, they can be anything at all. And so, as for why would someone do it? Well, because the person writing the server might have been better at Java than the person writing the application might have been better at C#. And it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, there's obviously concerns for speed and performance and whatever. But in general, if you do something and it conforms to a contract that other things can consume, you can swap one or the other and everything else still works. So I guess my point is, try not to be too precious about things like file types. If you need something to save data, have a save function, feed it the data you need to save, and then pick something. It doesn't have to be right, it just has to do the job, and you can come back later and then figure out if you need a different solution. Now, getting into saving has a whole series of stuff about performance and managing optimal types and stuff. And I think Jason would really go into this with Redis and that kind of stuff. But in general, you can get away with answering these questions later, you know?
Yeah, and I'm just trying to figure out what exactly it's built on.
Mm.
Is it actually built in anything C# or is it all Java? I'm just looking it up. I remember
Yeah, no
my kids
idea.
playing Hypixel on Minecraft. I didn't realize
Mm.
they were making a standalone game.
Yeah.
Custom engine built using. I don't know why they would use both. I mean, I assume they're using Java because they're familiar with it for
That's
back
what
end stuff,
my
right?
guess was. Yeah, right. You
They
have
built servers
you,
in it and they're building. I mean,
yeah.
as long as I guess as long as it's not exactly like it's worded, where the C# is calling into Java for the networking layer, because that would, I think,
Yeah, that's weird.
be
Like,
bad.
I kind of
Um,
doubt that's kind of seems unlikely.
but if it's just Java on the back end, yeah, it's totally fine. I mean, there are a lot of times when the back end server language is different from the front end. I mean, that's most web pages before Node, at least. You
Mm.
know, like they use totally different stuff in the back end. So, kind of curious. It sounds like, yeah, it's built in C# on the client and Java on the front end. I wonder what they're using C#. If they're using Unity or like some XNA thing. Seen people who want to build their own stuff go
Is
off of
XNA
XNA.
even still around? I thought that was at
There's
least been
like
defunct by now.
there's an open source branch of
Oh,
it
that's
somewhere
right, wasn't
that
there?
that
Yeah.
people use because they
I
just
dropped
want
out around
access to the
XNA 3
rendering.
before the open source one came out. Funnily enough, that was my first ever game engine. I learned
Oh,
to program well, I learned to program before that in VB ages before, but my first game engine was XNA.
oh, okay. XNA was fun. I remember when it came out, getting all excited that I could build stuff, building these crappy little shooters and deploying them to the Xbox. It was a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah.
fun, right? Just getting it like the first time when you see your game actually on the TV and you're playing it with a controller and you're flying around and shooting dumb little spaceships, but it's still exciting, right? Like,
Yeah, the very first thing that I think every programmer does this. They make something they're proud of. They think other people will use it, so they package it up, call it an API, and then try to give it to people to use.
yes.
And so you can find online, if you look hard enough, an old XNA input pipeline that I made years ago with the intent for exactly that. I was like, look, I built an input system. It keeps the two different states of the input. It manages bindings. You can have customizable XML files which can conform to different binding types. I built this entire input system just so I could write, if get button down and so on. Because fun fact, back in XNA, you didn't have get button down, get button up, get button. You had gamepad state. And you had to save the previous frames one, compare it to this frames one, and figure out if it was a button down or a button up. So I built
Yeah.
my own layer for that, and I think maybe 5 people downloaded it.
Yeah, because everybody had already solved that problem themselves,
Yeah.
right? Before they came across it. It was like, oh, I got to cache this. All right. And then they find it. I'm like, I already did it. It's fun. Somebody was asking here if I don't know which Jason had done web development before and how many years we'd spent
You mentioned
in
you did Angular, right?
that transition. Yeah, I'd done a little bit of Angular, a lot of ASP stuff before Angular even existed or was thought of,
Hmm.
and then a lot of Windows stuff, just
Hmm.
for a mix of things, enterprise tools, enterprise server stuff, and then lots of game tools too, doing web and literally, I think my first web stuff that I did professionally was actually for games, building some tooling to view and diff game data.
Mm.
Right? Like in my first week or so on the job in QA, building web tools to do QA diffs, which wasn't hard. I mean, it's like if you're doing basic web stuff, showing some data from a SQL server is pretty damn simple, and showing it
Yeah.
from multiple things and then highlighting the differences pretty simple, right? But it was a really good entry into the industry for me.
Funny how
Getting
daunting
into
that
stuff.
stuff is, right? Like when you first start, you're thinking APIs and web stuff, that's daunting. Databases, that's daunting. But once you start, they're kind of each of these things are a small problem to solve. And once you solve them, stitching them together is kind of easy in retrospect compared to the actual concept of how daunting the idea is.
Yeah, the things seem a lot harder than they are. Well, and all of them have like these weird different tools that look
Mm.
different, and like everything looks overwhelming. But once you spend a little bit of time with it, especially if you have somebody to help you, kind of guide you through step by step on the things, it can go a long way. You can pick it up pretty quick. Like now, when I see and hear of new things that sound crazy, I just kind of assume that like they'd be crazy. But if I spend like 2 or 3 days, they're not crazy anymore, and I can understand them and use them. I just have to find they have to prioritize whatever
Mm.
the thing is, you know. But
Yeah, I will say as well, the other thing that a lot of people get sort of worried about is people see themselves as one domain. Like I know a lot of people who are, they're back end developers. That's what they call themselves. And it's
oh,
like, have you actually tried doing a different kind of thing? And for example, I started by doing Java. Well, technically, I started by doing VB. My first real job was Java. And I went to another company, they wanted JavaScript. And I'd never done it before. And I knew they were different. And so when I went in, I was really worried. I thought, like, I don't know this language. They hired me on a tool I don't know. But it took 3 weeks, like 3 weeks to be pretty comfortable with it. Because
yeah,
once you know how to program, language is just it's another set of syntax. But conceptually, all of the rules are the same. And once you start getting to libraries, that gets confusing, learning precisely how, Newtonsoft JSON works versus how ADO.NET works versus React or Angular or whatever. Like each of these individual things have problems. But as a industry as a whole, you can pretty easily become a full stack developer. Like I've managed over the course of a career to work on native Android apps, desktop apps, services, websites, games, so many things, right? Because they're once you have the tools, you can pretty much pick up the next thing probably within 3 weeks or a month in most cases. At least that's my experience. What about you? Did you say the same?
um, yeah, I think so. I'd say all of the things that seemed crazy just kind of came in
Hmm.
probably about that same amount of time switching languages. I remember first jumping onto JavaScript. It's like, oh, I don't know what any of this is.
Yeah.
Or first jumping into CSS, like totally lost. Same with vector math or physics stuff, or just Unity. I remember the first time I opened up Unity, I popped up this window and I was like, "Holy shit, this looks like Maya. I don't know what I'm gonna do." I was like, I don't know. I was so used to just writing code in Visual Studio, right? Just writing
Yeah.
the C++ code and just coding away, and occasionally jumping into Unreal Editor to do something small, but mostly just writing code and then
Yeah,
jump
I
into
remember how
Unity, and
daunting
it's
mono
like,
behavior was, right? Because you're used to starting with an empty C# file with no base class,
yeah,
and then you're thinking, okay, this is simple. I have to add features. But you start with Unity, you write transform dot, and you see 100 things, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is
yeah, and
too
you're
many
like, where
things.
did this even come from? Like, where's this transform from? Before you realize, oh yeah, every time I create a
Yeah.
script, it's this base class with a whole bunch of stuff behind it and a whole ecosystem there. But
Mm.
then yeah, it was like within a day, I was like, okay, kind of got an idea of how to move things around and work with stuff, and then within a week, able to do somewhat, I wouldn't say productive things, but active things like make stuff
Yeah.
happen in the editor and in the engine and build something and play it. And yeah, it takes a couple weeks to keep going through. But
Yeah,
yeah,
obviously, I don't mean like it takes 3 weeks to become a master at something. I'm saying it
no,
takes
just
three weeks
to
to get
get proficient
be
enough where you
able to be
can,
comfortable. Yeah.
yeah, contribute
'Cause-
at least a little bit in
'cause
suboptimal ways usually, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
you're
because there's two
contributing, but you're still
phases. Yeah.
making mistakes.
Because there's like two phases of being a developer on something, right? There's the everything's daunting, and I'm sort of like taking baby steps because I'm afraid, right? Everyone's used a new library or system and goes dot this, press play, and sort of like you're sort of poking the system to see what it does. It takes about 3 weeks to go from I'm afraid of every new line I write to okay, I see how it works. I now just have to learn how to do it right through experience, right? Like that's what it for me anyway. It takes 2-3 weeks to get to the point where I'm like, I don't feel that fear anymore that I'm going to break everything or that I'm going to get lost in a system, you know?
Right. And that I think that also varies a lot just on the project.
Yeah. It depends how much
Just
of a deadline someone's ticking a clock behind you and tapping their watch.
yeah, and how crazy because I think like when I jumped on to EverQuest 2, it took me a while before I felt somewhat comfortable. But then when I jumped on to a mobile project or a VR game or like a relatively large enterprise app, much faster, right? It's like I remember the last enterprise app I jumped on. Was able to fix like 7 bugs the first day, right? Just kind of tearing through because the code is so simple and like
Yeah, yeah.
very familiar, right? If you're just working in regular C sharp, WPF and form stuff, it's relatively simple and straightforward. There's not a lot of that interconnection. So I guess going to games, it's definitely harder with games. I don't know if you feel the same way. Like
Oh, 100%. No,
the
seriously, because everyone hooks systems up differently. So you don't know where the input's going to live relative to another project. That's such a big difference than in most enterprise systems. There's sorts of ways to do things. Your
yeah,
your
they're
your
very
models are
common,
probably in
easy.
a persistence layer, etc. Like you can kind of guess where the lines are. You cannot guess in a game.
That's I think that's a very accurate explanation of why that is. Because yeah, it's just when you jump into a web project, you know generally where assuming depending on the place, you know where the that data layer is, where it's making API calls, where the endpoints are that you're accessing it, right? Or like in a Windows project, you know like what these main forms are, where the entry point is, and what's going on. With the Unity project, to be honest, like you don't even really know where the entry point is until you
Yeah,
start
yeah.
digging in, and it can be hidden in a dozen different places, right?
Like I have seriously, in real terms, have helped port at least 4 projects in my life, and in every one of those projects, where things were drastically different. For example, almost every big project will write their own input layer of some kind, even if it's just a wrapper around the Unity input. They'll write some layer. And in 2 of those systems that were event based, one of them was sort of like a singleton manager, and the other one was using like a signaling system where it's actually a separate event bus. And
Mm-hmm.
every single one of them lived in a different place, had different ways to call events, had different levels of coupling. Some references were obvious because they actually passed objects, which was both helpful for me but also harder to work with. And then other ones were dispatching abstract events into a system, and other things were listening to it, which was really hard for me to figure out where things were, but made it very easy to extend once I did figure that out.
Yeah,
So yeah, massively different depending on the project.
yeah, that's pretty much what I've seen too. With the other types of projects, they're either somewhat architected in an obvious way, or everything's in one file.
Mm.
Right? You get into web stuff and Windows stuff.
And the question is, it's always which is worse, right? Because they're both horrible in their own way.
Well,
One
with
is
at least with the
what
web
system did they make?
stuff, usually when they're separated out, they're in like they have some defaults, and I think
Hmm.
part of that, I wonder how much of it is just driven by the fact that when you create a new web project, you're given a folder structure, right? Or
Yeah.
you're given a template for like how the thing should be laid out, and when you're given a new Unity project, you have an assets folder, right? Like, you're just given like a folder with a scene subfolder and just go wild.
Hmm.
Like, I wonder if putting in some sort of foldering template would help or hurt.
I think it would really help because I think a lot of people haven't ever worked on a scale application to the point where they've had to sort of contend with their decision making. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you can get away with a lot of things when the project never gets so big that you lose track of them. But if it gets sufficiently big, that's the only time you went, oh, maybe I shouldn't have coupled that to this. And you're not going to see that unless the project lives 2 years. And it's a hard thing to admit, but most projects don't last 2 years. Some of them don't even make it that long, never mind live that long.
Yeah. Well, a lot of projects are, they got a 6 month or 9 month life cycle where they're done and they're shipped. And unless something drastically changes, you're on to the next, the next project, the next version of the thing. It happens, especially for non game Unity projects, right?
But I even mean like maintenance, right? Like if you produce a game and it's out,
Yeah.
you're very rarely maintaining it for 2 years. You're
Right.
usually
Yeah.
maintaining it for 3 months or 6 months. And
Yeah.
so you don't have to ever really contend with the fact that, okay, we're adding a DLC or a giant feature pack. How easy will that be based on the decisions we previously made? That kind of a question doesn't come up on a lot of medium-sized projects.
Yeah. It's very true.
I will say though, on the question of having to refactor or to port someone else's code, I hate to admit it, but I would rather have to refactor an under-architected system than an over-architected system, or a system where somebody tried their best to architect it but doesn't know what they're doing. Because
Yeah.
oftentimes trying to untangle a web someone made is much harder than adding practices and decoupling from a kind of large system.
It's true. Having an over-architected system is a good way to screw stuff up, and it's really easy to do because people find a pattern and just start building into that pattern and put everything into that pattern, right? And you just
Mm.
keep adding complexity for what if we need this thing in 3 years, and like you said, most projects don't even last
Yeah.
the 2 year line. And I've seen a lot of people build out like these super complex systems where they can do all kinds of shit. There's all kinds of extensibility points that nobody is ever going to use, right? And
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
never get touched. It never happens. And just yeah, or they build it like all these layers and layers of abstraction to do like one simple thing. Like you could
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
one call that does the one thing, or like 7 calls. And I've done it myself. I mean, I've
Yeah.
certainly done it where like I'm like, okay, we got this tiny little UI. We got one little window that's gonna pop up. Let's bring in a whole UI manager. Let's bring in a whole layer of stuff. Let's bring in eventing systems, all this stuff. Like we literally have one UI, one little
Yeah.
thing with like 3 buttons on it to pick. What the hell? So it's
The worst is when you're trying to figure out what line is called. So you look at something, and for me, it's F12. So you F12 in, and it goes into the next piece, and you F12 in. Okay, that's going here, and you're basically trying to follow the rabbit hole down, and you go 6 methods in to see like it equals true or something. It's like, really?
yeah.
Just I took all of this just to get to that line.
Or you firing off events that fire more events that fire another event before the thing actually happens. Yeah, I've done it all myself, and I've seen it plenty of times, right? Where it's just way overcomplicated and really, really easy to get lost in. I don't know. I've been lately just sticking with the rule of trying to make the code as readable and understandable as possible, and then dealing with performance considerations next. So like get
Yeah.
it
Well,
so that you can understand exactly what it does just by looking at it, reading it, and then
yeah.
going on to optimizing it. Like one of the things that really stuck for me was Bob Martin. I forget, he was quoting somebody. I forgot who now. About just code quality and code cleanliness, and saying that I wish I
Probably Kent Beck,
remembered the
I'd
whole thing,
say.
but he'd said that code should read like well written
Well written
prose.
prose. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. I think that's
right.
Kent Beck.
Yeah, and just the whole idea is like you should be able to just read the code like fluently without even thinking about it. Somebody who doesn't understand code ideally should be able to read it and have an idea of what it's doing and be able to even tell you what it's doing just by the naming of things, right? And that leads to a lot of very small methods. So you end up with a lot of like 1 to 5 line methods in there that just do a well named thing. And then those are just kind of strung together in other 1 to 5 line methods that well, just make it so that your code is very easy to understand it and flows. So you're not bouncing around going, okay, this fired off an event. Why did it fire off the event? What is that doing? Like what's going on there? Or this it's doing some calculation here and changing something, but if I got to go figure out what all these variables are, what is it calculating? What's this thing that it's trying to do? Like spelling that all out in just plain English goes a long way, or in plain Irish, I guess. It goes a long way.
There's no such thing as plain Irish. All Irish is confusing. Um, one of my favorite quotes along those lines, very similar, is something is complete not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And I really do keep that in mind when I'm writing code. And I ask myself, oh, maybe I should add these other 5 features. It's like, do I need those? Could I get to this? Could I get this as clean as I want and get rid of all this extra stuff that I like, helpers I thought I'd need, or methods that have multiple overloads, or all these little things that I thought would be nice. But if I can get rid of them and keep all of the same features, that's when your code is at its best, when it does what you need and exactly what you need, and doesn't have all of this sort of floating nebulous behavior.
Right. All the extra stuff that, yeah, you kind of thought you needed along the way, but you can actually strip out. Yeah, same boat. Just kind of what I've been trying to do is before I commit, just go through and make sure one that it's the I forgot the word already, the beautiful prose stuff, right? That it
Oh,
reads
the
well,
pros, yeah,
and
yeah.
two that there's nothing extra in there. Especially one thing I've been fighting myself against is optional parameters. Having a bunch
Mm,
of having optional parameters where I use one, like I just kind of flip. It's used like twice or once. So it seems
yeah.
like it's the wrong way to go in that case a lot of the time, and a lot of the time I can just refactor it out and not need that parameter at all.
You
Was
also
it?
brought up a good point earlier when you said try not to. First of all, you make it good, and then you work on making it performant. And
Yeah.
that's something else I want to mention because I see this a lot. I see people starting a new system and asking, "How do I do this with no garbage?" or "How do I make this work and avoid generating mess?" And I always try to point out and pause and say, "Hang on a second, you haven't even made a system yet and you're trying to clean it and make it faster. Like, make it first, make it work, then go in and start to optimize." And I think that people often forget the 80/20 rule, where 20% of your time will have 80% of your benefit. So when you've built a system and something is slow, there's normally one reason it's slow, one pretty big thing, and you want to get rid of that first. So if you spend an hour or two writing the most optimized system for reading a string and you use it 3 times, you've wasted a very long time. But if
Right.
you've got a giant list of 1,000 items and you're using a slow search algorithm, that's where your time should be spent. So
Yeah.
rather than asking the question, should I optimize or should I be really performant here? Make it, look at the profiler, see what's slow, and go in order what will have the biggest positive impact to my game. Now, obviously, you can consider these things in advance, but if you find yourself going down a rabbit hole of trying to optimize something that doesn't even exist yet, you're probably like lost the forest for the trees.
And you're going to end up writing ugly code, right? You're going to end
Yeah,
up
there's
writing
that
things
too.
that are
Yeah,
hard to maintain and hard to follow because you had this memory, you had this layout in your head of exactly how it was going to work, and that's not going to translate in the code very well. So you're going to just be focused on that. Yeah, make it work and then make it fast. Oh, and only make it, I think Kristen said this right, only make it fast if it matters, which is
yeah,
also
yeah,
the case, right? Like, depending on the scenario, and kind of like what you said, if you're only calling it 3 times, and it's slow as in it takes a millisecond, who cares? Right?
mm,
Like, don't worry about it. Just work on the actual hot path, the things that are going to matter. And that
yeah,
mostly comes down to profiling, which I guess is something we probably just talked briefly
mm,
about, just on using the profiler. Like, when
yeah.
do you do your profiling, or like what leads you to jump in, go like, okay, I'm going to start profiling stuff now?
The, there's the answer I should say. There's the real answer. The answer I should say is when I notice performance hitches. The real answer is when I've finished doing something and I'm bored and I want to take a break and do something a bit easier. the,
That's
the fact
hilarious.
is, the fact is, I'll build something and I'll be working on it and be like, oh, I've just been like either coding for the last 3 hours or I've been nudging stuff in Unity and I want to just get back to something. And I find profiling is something you can kind of, it's almost like watching a TV show, right? You take a break from what you're doing, you look at the profile, you kind of just like look at your project and jump around and you just sort of, oh, look, there's a spike there. And you just make some notes and now you've given yourself the next thing to do. That's unfortunately the real answer. I probably should have a more structured method for it, but realistically, I just hit some point where I get bored or tired and I go, what's the biggest current garbage issue for my game? And I'll write down the thing and then I'll fix that problem. And then 3 weeks later or 2 weeks later, I'll see another one and go, let's do this again. And I'll just basically tick away at it. And by the time you get to the end of the project, you've taken out the 5 or 6 biggest kind of performance hogs just by the nature of doing that over time.
That's I like that just because I do the same thing. Like,
Good. I don't feel as bad now.
yeah, like I mean, I'll do performance testing before I commit like a big system. We got a big change going in, that I know whatever I did should have some performance impact, or like I should be worried about how it performs. I'll test it, but a lot of the time when I get to profiling, it's just that I'm mentally tired, and
Yeah,
like I want to let
exactly.
the computer do some work for me. I don't want to think anymore about what I need to code or what I need to do, and I'm just like, I can run the profiler. I can sit there. I can just look and go, oh, look, here's a problem. easy fix. And because almost always it's just a simple little fix, right? It's like, oh, I'm allocating
Yeah,
something I don't really need to
exactly. Yeah.
allocate. I can clean that up. Or, oh, this is some loop that doesn't need to run or whatever it is. Most of the time it's just something that I can cache. Like 90% of the time, the performance problems are like, oh, I could just cache that thing. Just make a
And also,
dictionary or,
like, I think people underestimate too that if you've been doing any kind of work like this for even a little while, you start to get a sense of where your problems are going to be, right? Like, we all know if you're doing iterating loads of objects, there's a good chance that's slow. If you're doing a sort thing, that's probably slow. You're doing a search thing, that might be slow. There's issues that can arise if you're doing um, like strings. If you're doing a lot of work with strings, these are just sort of things in the back of your mind as these are areas where I'll probably have performance issues.
Mhm.
And so even if you don't mean to, you're probably going to do micro optimizations as you go, not full on zero garbage, but you'll at least aim for sort of, I know I probably won't allocate here, so, or I should probably avoid putting that variable in this place. So I kind of find that over time, you just get into the habit of being more cautious around particularly hog intensive tasks, right? So I just noticed myself that it's not, I already know where the problems will probably appear. I very rarely, it does happen from time to time, but I very rarely open the profiler and go, oh my God, that function is causing a huge hog in my system. Like that doesn't really happen very often, right? At least not for
Right.
me. Like, what about you?
Yeah, no, for me, a lot of the time it's link queries. So
Yeah,
when I'm
yeah.
first putting stuff together, I'll use a lot of link queries because
They're so easy
I'm not
because they're,
sure exactly what I want to do, and it's very easy
yeah.
to get the result right. Like I want to select some set of data from some collection. It's very simple to do it with a link query and change it as I'm developing. So I'm not sure exactly what data I'm going to need, how I'm going to need it, or whatever. So I'll write up a link query to grab it, and then I'll later on when I'm profiling, I'm like, oh yeah, I got to go back and change out the queries that I actually need. And then that's
Mm.
also one of those times where I'll go through and maybe delete them too. It may just be that I don't need to have them, or I can merge whatever the select I was doing or the update I was doing into something else, into some other loop that's running as part of the process. So it's
Yep.
I'd say the biggest one for me is link queries or some string concatenation
String
stuff.
stuff. Yeah. I find like
Right.
there's a lot of really cool things you can do to avoid string allocations with, if you have like a score system or a set of numbers are going to always be within a certain range.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's yeah.
Or if you
I'm
just got
probably
a
the same.
static string that you need to reuse over and over.
Yeah.
Like, you just need to keep showing the same thing, but you got a new instance of the class constantly creating it.
And that's the other thing too, is right, is when it comes to this sort of optimization, I think a good example, I'm going to assume you do the same, which is 99.9% of the time, if I'm creating lots of objects, they will eventually be in a pooling system
Yep.
because that's just obviously the right answer. But 99.9% of the time, I will build the system first by instantiating it because there
Yeah.
is no point in me before I've even built the system I want to go off and make a pooling system or grab a pooling system or start working with that. I can prove that it does what I need to by just instantiating, make it work, and then pop in the pooling system afterwards. And I think that comes back to the optimization thing. I would be willing to bet 90% of Unity devs do the same thing. Even though they know they will eventually end up with a pooling system, you don't start with one. You start by making your code work the way you want to, and then you just add in as you go. And it's, at least that's my guess anyway. I assume you do the same thing.
Yeah, 100%. Because I've done it before. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure everybody has the other way where you're like, okay, I need these things. I'm gonna pull them, so I'll go build a
Yeah.
pooling system, and then I never get around to building the actual thing that I needed to build, or the thing that I wanted to build changes. Right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a little bit different, and the pooling system doesn't necessarily match. And it's just it's one of those things. I feel like it's an easy distraction. It's easy to
Yeah.
avoid building your game and just build up common systems that are just rebuilt that you've built before, or that you're just kind of copying from other places, and avoid actually building the game itself. It's just I've seen myself do it and other people do it a lot, but yeah, I make it quick and dirty at first, and then optimize as you go.
See, that's another secret too. You bring up a very good point too. Distracting yourself. I think this is something a lot of programmers don't admit to themselves. There are systems that are useful to your game, and there are systems that are fun to make.
Yes.
And you will oftentimes waste your time on the stuff that's fun that is not relevant to what you're supposed to be doing. And a good example of this is the amount of times I've talked to somebody and they're telling me they're making this game and it's like a god game or some sort of simulator thing. And they're like, yeah, I'm building this procedural thing so I can put infinite sets of multiple trees down. And you're like, well, what's your game? Oh, well, you kind of click things and move characters. Said, okay, so your game is clicking and moving characters. Said, yeah. What are you working on now? Well, the procedural tree building. Like, well, where's your game? Like,
Yeah.
you've completely moved away from what you actually think you're making because this thing is more fun and it's kind of cool to make. And
Yeah.
it takes a lot of restraint to come back and work on the thing that actually is needed for your project.
Yeah. I've done that too.
Yeah. Oh, and I've done it. Like
like
100%, I've done the same thing.
like I want to build this system. Oh, this is really interesting. I found some, especially if you find a new piece of technology that you can start to work
Yeah.
in, right? You're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna build a whole thing around this bit of tech, and I'll get back to the game part after that because I need this thing in here first before I can build the game. It's
Yeah.
yeah, very common
I was
problem.
once building this thing and I forgot what it was exactly, but it was like, I don't know, a series of buttons and doors and components, kind of a very simple enough idea. But I was really into hinges and joint systems in Unity at the time. So I spent like 4 hours building a button that had really good physics that would press and bounce, and you had to apply objects on it to press it. And I had a door with this really nice hinge thing. And I suddenly blinked and went, I've just spent 5 hours building a door and a button when I could have just dropped them in and put a single animator on it and just gotten back to work. But I was
Yeah.
having too much fun doing it, and it just defeats the point of what I'm actually here for.
Yep. And we all get caught in it. It's good to at least admit it, right? I
Yeah.
think a lot of people, you're right, just don't admit it. Can
Mm.
you take questions for 1 second and step AFK? Just
Sure.
really briefly, or see if
Let me
anybody.
see what's anything in the
I
chat.
see a lot of people just asking questions and stuff, and I just need to
Mm.
step away for like 2 minutes. I figured
Go
people
for it.
could spam them in now, and don't forget to hit the like button while I'm gone, though, so I know that everybody likes Jason more than me. I'm just kidding. Just hit it though anyway, so we can get up over 200 before I'm back. I'll be right back.
Cool. In regards to common systems, spending time on those and generic scalable way has saved me a lot of time later on. Okay, yes. So this brings up a good point. Um, yes, there is a point at which making something modular or kind of generic will certainly save you time, but I think it really falls into this thing, the kind of the three use rule, right? Like you don't aim to make something modular before you know what the modules are, or you don't aim to make something that can support multiple different configurations if you have only gotten one written down on a piece of paper. So I try to avoid making a modular system or generic scalable system until I make one, then I come up with at least the idea for a second one, maybe make that. And by the time I get to the third thing, I'm like, hang on a second, these all have properties in common. Maybe I can turn these into some sort of system that will do this for me at a scalable way. So it often is beneficial to have a modular system, but the problem, I'm not saying that it isn't a good thing to do. I'm saying it's not a good thing to do first. So just in general, aim for make it work. Same repeating thing again, right? Like make it work, then make it good, and then make it scalable, I guess. Gesture pattern recognition. Any experience with it? Um, Not specifically. I have done voice recognition and face recognition systems, but I find we live in an age now where a lot of this stuff falls into the category of third party libraries. And you can often, this is actually another interesting point. There's a lot of really complicated things you can do by just stitching together existing services. So I've worked in applications like an AR game, for example, where you're using GPS data and AR and point cloud recognition to do interesting stuff by just combining existing libraries. And I've done the same thing with voice recognition and image recognition and combining them together to do interesting things. And this often sounds like a very large and lofty goal, but realistically, there are tons and tons of libraries out there you can consume and do really cool stuff with. For example, I once made a voice controlled application that would search for TV shows for me. And all I did was talk to the TV database. And then on the other end of things, I had the Microsoft text to speech stack, or speech to text rather. So I guess my point is there's tons of libraries you can consume out there to build really complicated applications that you don't have to build yourself from scratch. So yeah, I haven't specifically used kind of drawing tools. But I guess my point is almost any cool idea you have, you can probably find a library that'll get you there to start with. You don't really have to make a lot of this stuff by yourself. What do you think about addressables? Oh, you're back, Jason. Okay, there we go. Question for you. What do you think about addressables? I think you made a video on it, didn't you?
Yeah, and I've got another one I'm kind of working on. I think that they're pretty damn cool and pretty powerful. I think in the video that I did was showing how you can use them to unload stuff so that you've loaded in and just kind of unload the data to reduce your memory footprint, which has been useful for some other projects I've been working on. But I think that overall, addressables make asset bundles and managing bundles extremely simple. So if you want to have downloadable updates for things, or you want to beyond being able to control what stuff is loaded in memory and having I think a bit stricter control over that, just being able to have bundles that you can stream down in an easy way without having to build out the whole system yourself is really nice. I think they kind of simplify stuff that a lot of people were building themselves for every project. So a lot of companies had like their own custom systems on top of asset bundles to make them easy to work with and easy to manage. And
A
addressables
surprisingly
just
core thing too, right? I think most projects I've worked on had some need to download assets,
yeah.
and it was just funny how it's not. It just wasn't really an obvious solution for that problem.
No, it was just asset bundles and strings and building, basically having to build up your own infrastructure over it, or have the stuff kind of messy in code and hard to follow. So I think addressables. I think eventually everybody will be using them almost as a default, but I don't know. Yeah, I've been wrong before, so we'll see.
So actually, this is a question for you because I'm curious to see your answer. When to mono behavior and when to not?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, let's see. A couple times when I'll make a mono behavior. Let's see. I'm just trying to think this through. I guess it's really when I need either direct access to something on the game object. A lot of time, if I have a mono behavior, I'm working with the actual transform of the object. I'd say
Mm.
a good chunk, probably at least half the mono behaviors I have are probably doing something with the transform or the animator or some other component that's like a built-in Unity component of the object, right?
Mm.
So I'm doing something with a renderer, flipping on images, and wanting to have references to those things. So there's usually classes that I have a serialized field on, or I'm getting a component in the awake and caching it, and then doing something with that component directly. Or there's a scenario where I want to be able to compose behaviors on a prefab or game object. So I'll have these mono behaviors that I'm just dropping on and then modifying and building up the objects by putting those on. Outside of that, I'd try to have, I'd say, non-mono behavior by default. If you don't need a game object, you don't need that game object lifecycle, or you can manage the lifecycle yourself, or you just don't need a lifecycle on the object at all. Definitely shouldn't have a mono behavior, or if it's just like a sub thing that another mono behavior is spawning, like the stats for a player, for instance, don't need to be a mono behavior. There's no thing that stats are directly impacting, or that they should be doing on a game object, so those wouldn't be on a mono behavior. Um, I don't know. I guess that's kind of it. So yeah, just start with not a mono behavior by all means, unless there's some really specific need for it. I'd say
Mm.
probably 1/4 of the classes that I write are usually about mono behaviors.
Yeah, I'd be about the same. I think we actually sort of accidentally answered this question earlier because when you asked the question, when do you use abstract classes? If you think about it, a mono behavior, as far as we're concerned, is an abstract base class. We're
Yes.
inheriting a bunch of behaviors. So the question is, when do you want to use one? When you need the things in it, and predominantly the things that either a good chunk of the things in it, or at least some core components of it. So I'd fall firmly into the same category. I wouldn't really use mono behaviors unless I need the things on the mono behaviors. Otherwise, I would rather compose behaviors into a mono behavior and use it as like an entry point for that object, a controller of the various subparts of it. That's usually how I would.
Yeah.
Kind of same thing, right? One out of every 4 scripts would be something that would compose other scripts to do some work.
Right. Yeah. It's going to be doing a lot of the time, like I said, it's going to be calling stuff in other classes that are doing the actual work. Not always. I mean, sometimes the the mono behavior is just doing the work. Like the work is as simple as like a mono behavior I wrote a couple days ago. I think I showed a couple days ago was just a simple one to flip an image on and off based on an event. Right, event
Mm.
fires off, like says our state changed. Like, am I stunned? If I am, the image is on. If I'm not, it's off. Nice, simple, tiny mono behavior. And I think that's an important thing with mono behaviors is keeping them small, right? Like
Mm.
not having big, giant, monolithic mono behaviors where you have a ton of stuff on there
Yeah.
because that's when it gets really, really hard because you can't just drop the you're losing that componentization that Unity gives you, right? Because you now have this one big thing. It's not just little components that you're dropping on there.
Well, again, exactly. Yeah, because the components are supposed to be interconnected to do a job. If you've
Yeah.
got one component doing 5 jobs, then you're kind of defeating the point of using a component model.
Yeah. 100% agree. Big fan
Um,
of nice small classes. You want to talk about that real quick? Just class size and function size.
ooh, okay. I suppose. Well,
It's a fun
this is an
discussion.
interesting one in general. Yeah. So this is more. So I want to make a little asterisk here and say before we start this conversation, we're not talking about Unity at all. This is a just general programming thing, and it applies a lot to C Sharp, but in general, in programming, the point of a so how do I phrase this? Um, Software that we write, all programming languages, every single programming language you use, it's not built for the computer. Computers don't speak our language. They speak machine language. And so every single language serves one purpose. It's a way to mediate between us and the computer. So every single language, the point of it is to be understandable, to be easy to write and easy to read. So by definition, it should be easy to write and easy to read. That's the point of the languages. And so if you're writing a script, to go back to the read like good prose, that's what it should be. A script should be something that says, I am effectively outlining the behaviors I need to do and how easy it is to do them. It should be readable, it should be simple. And so there's some kind of conceptually obvious rules if you say them out loud. Try to fit everything on one screen. Don't let it scroll off to another to like use a scroll bar to read the other half of a line. That should be pretty obvious, right? Because you wouldn't want that in a real book. You wouldn't want to scroll off and read half a sentence. And the same
Right.
thing, don't make it too long to the point where it's a run-on sentence. It's hard to read if you can't parse it in a clean way. So treat all the same rules you would for writing a story, for writing code. Clean, small chunks, understandable, and get points across in distinct ways. So we could break it down into literal numbers and suggested things and don't use more than 3 arguments in a method, all these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, it boils down to you know when something's hard to read. You read your own code and go, ugh, what was that again? And you're trying to find something. And the answer is if it's hard for you to read, make it easier to read. That's all I can say.
It's funny when you were talking about that, comparing it to writing. It made me just realize that now I write my code a lot like I write my emails with like one sentence per line.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's how I tend to write my emails like that because I find it so much easier to read and follow the flow. Whenever I get a big email that's like just paragraph, I struggle to like keep my place, especially you got big screens, right? Like the
Mm.
text is scrolling all the way across, and you're like, gosh, well, totally lost, and you got to shrink it down. So I try to write my emails like that, where it's just like easy to read, like bite, and I've been doing the same in code because I just find it so simple to follow that flow and see exactly what's going on.
Mm.
It's
And I
very
think that
interesting.
there's a lot of stuff you can do that will get you that same cleanliness if you take a deep breath and think about it. Like there's a great concept. So the book in question, to kind of if you really want to dive into this, is literally called Clean Code. It's Bob Martin's book, and it'll go through a lot of this and make you really think about the code you're writing. But the one that really stuck out to me more than all the other rules in the book were just the idea of noise words. And that's basically it's pretty simple when you say it in retrospect. If I had a system called Health Value Manager, how many of those words are adding information that is helpful to me to read? There's health, of course it's a value, and I'm managing it. Well, what if I just called it health?
Right.
What am I losing by calling it health versus health value manager? And so oftentimes you can look at your code and say, hang on a second, how many of the words that I added sound cool and programmery and aren't actively adding value or actually making it harder to read if you're injecting these things into other things? And this is a big problem between people who learn design patterns. Just because something is a factory and just because something is a command doesn't mean you have to write the word factory or command at the end of every single thing if it can conceptually make sense in the context you're using it in. So to go back to making it read like English, don't add noise words. Don't add words that you look at and go, like I see people who prefix things with whatever it is. Health, 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 health. So health system dot health setter dot set health. All these just we
Yeah.
get it. Health system dot set will set the health because it's in the thing, right? Even
Right.
system could be removed there. So try to avoid the noise effectively.
I think that's great advice. And just shrinking class names, especially, right?
Yes.
Like that's, like, I like to have well-named methods that explain exactly what they do. But yeah, what happens with what you're saying is the class names get huge, and then you make a call to something in there, and suddenly it's a giant line to call into a little method, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I've done the same, and I try to go back and refactor them. Or you have a little local variable that's got like a 5-word name. You're like, ah, crap. Now it's like this dot health dot whatever, and this dot whatever. It's the whole yeah. I'm.
Mm.
It's fun talking to you, man. I just agree on so many things.
Yeah, and it's funny how like we took different routes to get to the same place, and we come across the same kinds of rules and opinions. Because some of this
Yeah.
stuff, I don't want to say like it's not obvious when you first learn it, but as you start to do things, you hit the same pain points and kind of come to the same conclusions.
Yeah. I yeah.
Oh, and actually, on that point you said about variable names, this is an interesting one again from that clean code book, and it really made me think about it. Is the length of a method or class should be directly proportional to the depth of the scope. So what I mean by that is classes should have very short names and methods should have very long names. Or not very long, but longer than the
Longer.
classes.
Yeah.
Because the reason is a class by definition is a conceptual idea like a holder, while a method is a task. It's actually doing a particular thing. So in general, try to keep the length of the take words out of the class name and put them into the methods that represent the actions it's performing. He described
Yeah.
it far better than I did there, but it's an interesting idea once you kind of think about the relationship between how detailed is a method versus how detailed is a class. Classes don't tend to need many keywords, and if something is complicated, you can often say entity dot do the complicated thing, not complicated thing doer dot do. It usually
Yeah.
makes a lot more sense to invert that.
It's a whole lot easier when, yeah, the first way. Right?
Yeah.
And then you don't have to remember what that weird name of the class is either, or all of the instances that are named after the class name that's some long giant thing. So, yeah, and then
And yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say someone brings up a good point, and it's the counterpoint to what I said, and it's a very valid one, which is terms like health manager and health controller have particular connotations in game development. So, for particular, an animation controller implies that it's going to be mitigated, managing between the player and the animator, and likewise, a character controller, a character manager sort of implies the manager will manage the character in its entirety, the character controller will drive it around, and the character will be sort of like the cohesive whole of the object or the data model, depending on which way you've designed the hierarchy. My, I don't want to say counterpoint to that because that's 100% valid. That's getting into a category called domain knowledge or glossary, depending on which way you want to go. But that's the one valid case, because when I say controller or manager, what I'm saying is they're noise words when they mean nothing. In the context you're in, if they have no value, then they are noise. But in the context of some systems, these words actually have meaning. And so this comes down to where you are working. If you're working in a system where words have particular connotations and meanings, that's perfectly fine because you're actually the whole point, like I said, is the word adding value or is it adding noise? So if it's adding value, if you can tell me health controller gives you more information than health, then it isn't noise anymore.
Right.
So that's why that one is okay. But just keep in mind, like the point is, in general, we use controller as a suffix for everything.
Yeah.
Every system is a localization controller, health controller, system controller, level controller. Like they're just arbitrary, right? Like use it when it's actually adding value to what you're doing.
Yep. That sounds right to me. Just thinking back all the code that had the word control. Like that's an easy
Yeah,
one to just add on there too. Just like,
it
I
is
don't
right.
want to call this health, so I'll add in control, or I don't want to call this whatever just the noun is that it actually is, and you just want to add it in, because and a lot of the time what happens is because they want that to be a property, right? They want what should be the class name to be a property name on the class. Right? The
To be
health
honest, I'm
controller
going to
has
be
a health value on it.
I'm going to be less polite about it, and I'm going to say I guarantee subconsciously a lot of programmers write it because it sounds cooler. It's a system. It's a health manager. It's the health component system. It feels like it's doing a lot of cool stuff. Let's be real. It's not as satisfying to say health.set when it's health management module dot update health component. You know what I mean? People enjoy writing code because it feels very cool. And I think a lot of people, if they're being honest with themselves, because I did it, I'm only saying this as someone who did that. I used to build component systems and various cool things because I like the idea of these interconnected, clever systems. And it's only later on when you start maintaining these clever systems, you wish you'd been a lot less clever with your systems.
Yeah, that happens to all of us. Hold on, I'm trying to fix an issue real quick. 1 second. Just trying to clear this. I have no idea how to do this. Oh, okay, there we go. Try to remove some random spam. Nobody types that fast. Like, well hidden spam though. Anyway, I forgot what I wanted to jump onto. There was there was a question in chat that I thought was kind of interesting and I wanted to answer, but I wanted to see if we could get 200 likes before we do that, which was on, do you use dependency injection or
Ooh.
inversion, or do you just inject your dependencies, or what do you do? So
I have a
you can't
bottled
answer it
rant
until
on
we get
this.
to 200
So
likes, Jason.
yeah,
So.
that's the thing. Is I have a whole bottled rant. So once we get to 200 likes, you'll get your huge rant on this topic.
Yeah. No. Oh no. Go ahead. I was just kidding.
I'm kidding. Yeah. So this is actually a really big, interesting topic to me, and I find the reason it's interesting is because people conflate the two. So a lot of people think that they're the same thing.
That's
What I
dependency
mean,
inversion and dependency injection because they both have a
exactly. Yeah.
DI.
Yeah. And you can even say the same about inversion of control. That's the other one. And so I guess the point is one of them is an architectural decision you make. One of them is a way to resolve that architectural decision. So let me try to explain that in a less confusing way. So when you build a system, there's inherently going to be a dependency. It's somebody knowing about something else. So if you're working with somebody else, say you're trying to make a cup of tea and you're beside the table that has all the tea bags and the milk, and then someone else is over by the kettle, you have to pass things to them so you know about each other. And so there's an inherent relationship between one to the other. And this is about all of software does this, where one thing needs to know about another thing. And the problem happens to be usually the flow of dependency flows downwards, which means the big thing has all of this information about the things inside of it. So you end up getting this problem where systems have this really nested dependency where everything is completely reliant on each other, and it starts to get very confusing. So what you can do is a design decision is where you take out a dependency. So let me see if I can give a good example. If I had a system that is, whenever I press the mouse, I print to the screen. So that would me say, on mouse press, print to screen. That I will call this script screen printer, as unsatisfying as the name of that is. That screen printer knows about two dependencies because the direction is flowing down inside of it. This screen printer has two dependencies, one on a mouse and one on the printing thing. In this case, we'll say it's TextMesh Pro. It's printing to TextMesh Pro. So because of this, that is dependent on both of those different things. And if I want to change one of them, I have to change the entire class, the big thing, because the small thing changed. So the dependency basically says the big thing changes because the small details have changed. And that's really frustrating because the small details are the things that change all the time. The big things, like when input, do thing on screen, or print message, I could change where the message goes and I could change what's causing that to happen, whether it's a mouse or a key press or a gamepad. They're the small details, they're likely to change, but I would have to rewrite the big thing to support that small change. In an ideal world, I would be able to say that the rule at a high level is when something happens, show message, and I can worry about the small details. And then the dependency is that the small things know about the big thing, not the other way around. So effectively, that's what inversion of control is. You take the control out from the usual route of big thing knows about small things, and change it so that the small things have to know about the big thing to inject themselves into it. And once you've got that, there's this thing. I don't want to get too far into this detail, but that's really good and helpful. And once you start going down that road, you can do some really nice stuff with it. But you get into this problem now where you're having to inject small things into small things all of the time. And you have to, it's called resolving dependencies. It's where this thing needs to know about the thing that does the printing, and the thing that needs to do the printing needs to know about where it's doing the printing to, and the thing that's doing the printing over here needs to know about where to get the information. It just goes down this kind of chain. And so rather than do that yourself, you often use a dependency injection framework. And what that'll do is it'll say, give me this thing, and it will figure out the entire network of things for you, inject all the right stuff into the right places, and give you the answer. And that saves you an awful lot of hassle, but also lets you have good architecture. Now, the point of all of that rant is that the first one is really important. It is very good practice to invert your dependencies.
Hmm.
But it's not always good practice to use a dependency injection framework. It can be, but that's a lot of architecture to solve a small problem. So if you have this situation where you have this thing I mentioned earlier, where I've got like the clicker message printer thing, I only have two dependencies. The printer clicker, I pass in mouse and I pass in message to text message pro. And then great, everything works. And then I make another one and I pass in keyboard and I pass in console. And I make a third one and I'd say pass in, Xbox button, and I pass in print to a web service. So I managed to repeat this thing, change out these elements, and everything's fine. But I can do that manually. It's just a few lines of code. It's not that complicated. I don't have a dependency chain of 10 things deep. And so I don't need this huge architecture of this automatic self-injecting system that can lead to this really complicated overarching kind of architecture. So yeah, I guess long story short, I always try my best to invert control so that I have the most freedom to work with my components. I only use dependency injection frameworks when my dependency tree has gotten so large that I physically can't describe it anymore. That's basically my rule.
Okay, that makes sense. And then just to, I guess, clarify for everyone listening who's like, well, how the hell do you do this without a DI framework? Like, what does that look like? I know one obvious and easy way to do it is through just some factories, right? Factories
100%, yeah, just a simple factory
that
usually is what I
inject
do.
all of the dependencies. They create the object and they give it all of the dependencies for you, or call it, you pass it some info to tell it what dependencies to
Yeah.
create in there. But a lot of the time, it's just factory methods that do that generation. At least for me, I don't, or sometimes it's just in the constructor that things are passing in whatever dependencies they know about to the other things that need to know about it, right? Like
Yeah.
I have a simple mover class that can move an entity around, and I may pass in the transform, right? And it just needs to know about the transform because this class is only responsible for moving. How it moves depends, like could be multiple different movers based on like if I'm flying around or I'm walking or I'm in the water or whatever. And I may want to change that behavior, but I'm always just going to inject in the transform instead of having it be like a component that knows and can access the transform. We just inject those things in, or whatever other info if it needs to know about stats, right? For how fast
Yeah.
I can move, I might inject in a movement stat or even an entire a way to access that movement stat, a reference to a stat system or a reference to a delegate that is the call to get whatever that movement speed is, something like that.
A common example for me would be say like if you've got a game that's got a grid or a world concept. So imagine you're making a zoo, or more accurately, maybe it's like a park. So you got a park with a bunch of animals, dogs and cats running around.
Okay.
So a technical problem to solve as a programmer is you want each animal that you create in this park to be able to interact with the other animals. So usually you want to pass a reference to the park that it's in to each animal so that it knows like look at neighboring animals and interact with neighboring animals. And so what Jason was alluding to was the idea that you'd have to say new dog park, new cat this park, other cat this park, and you're passing in this thing the whole time. You could create a factory that says animal factory, and you say, by the way, we're using this park at the moment. And then create dog, create cat, create dog, create cat, create birds, create whatever. And we've injected in the park that we're in. And if we have another dependency later on where you want to have, some sort of time manager so the animals know what time of day it is. You put that into the factory, you can add it to all the different elements, and then all the dogs and cats and things get that extra dependency without having to manually create and reference it in every side. So you can use a factory to basically say, every time I make A, B, and C, these will need 1, 2, and 3. Just wrap that idea together in a tight bow and then go make thing, make thing, make thing, and it's all done once. That might be something at some point we should do an example of, because that's hard to describe.
Yeah, it could be a good one. And I think I'm even showing the fact that you might not even need to necessarily pass in the whole part. You might just need one little bit or one interface implementation from it, right? Like you may be able to just pass in and I get nearest neighbor or whatever, or even a delegate to the method that just gets that. If they only need to do like one thing or they only need a small subset, and those things might be swappable, or you want to be able to test that animal with a mock version of a park, right? So you want to do some other stuff. You may just put in a small interface that's just the pieces of it that you need. Huh. Yeah, it might be a
I've
good
seen
code
other
example
examples
to do.
too. Like I've seen one of the ones from the design patterns book was they used like a pizza shop or something, and the idea was in order to make pizzas you need ingredients, so you pass in a ingredient provider, and so you could say make pizza, make cheese pizza, make vegetarian pizza, make meat pizza, and that's it. You don't think about anything else, but you can instantiate a version of that pizza factory that takes in fresh ingredients factory or local, different providers of different ingredients. You can take in one that has, sun-dried tomatoes and the meat is going to be pepperoni, and you could have a second one which is, you know, fresh tomatoes and ham, and the pizzas are still saying make cheese pizza, make meat pizza, and it's just working. And the different dependencies are injected in. You don't have to think about it anymore. So you've separated out the idea that pizzas require ingredients, but when I say get me a cheese pizza, I don't need to care about ingredients. I don't care whether it's feta cheese or whatever. That's up to somebody else to decide in the factory. My job is to say I need a pizza to work with the rest of whatever the system does.
That's a good book too. The gang that was
One
in
of
the
my
Gang of
favorites. Yeah.
Four design patterns book
Yeah, I have both of them behind me somewhere.
on the factory pattern.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I looked at that thing. It's interesting. There's some
Yeah.
discussion about whether or not 17 is too old to get started with programming. I'm gonna say it probably is. If you haven't started by like age 9,
Yeah, you're done.
just give up. Too late. Try something else. Be a doctor. Something easy, right? No, I mean realistically though,
I
I
started
know
at 18.
people who've
I
started
didn't write a
coding in their
single line of
40s.
code till I was 18. So there
Yeah.
you go. You're already younger than I was when I started.
I wrote code when I was a little kid, but that was out of desperation and need, right? And it wasn't good code, right? It wasn't usable code, but it was just I needed games and I only had 3 and I could not buy one, so I tried to make my own. It didn't really work out well. I don't know that I ever created anything I would want to play, but I had fun telling the computer what to do and having it listen to me.
Well, this is back to that sneaky thing I mentioned before, right? There are some things that are fun to program and some things that are actually practically useful. And oftentimes, I've said this tons of times. When I was a kid, I always wanted to make games and never did. And when I first finally got to the point that I started using a game engine, my first thought is, this is the best level editor I ever used. I
Yeah.
used to play Tony Hawk's and build cool level editors, and now I'm just doing it, but it's a game engine. And realistically, it's the same tool set, right? It's just I have more tools at my disposal than I ever did before.
It's funny. It's funny how bad working on games has killed my desire to do any modding or level creating. Like I used to
Yeah.
love doing that stuff, making mods, making content and stuff, creating levels. I had a blast with that, and now it all just feels like it's like a stripped down version. Like I could do the same, but I can also have 100% control over the game. Of course, it's way more work and
Yeah.
not a super realistic translation 1-to-1. But it makes it really hard for me to get that. Like when I see people go in and build crazy things in Fortnite or Minecraft or whatever game, I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. I can do that and a whole lot more though. Like and
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
100% control and not have to use weird tools that work on a controller. Like, oh, that's
No, I'm exactly the same. I used to play a lot of level editors. I used to really enjoy, like, I remember I played a lot with the Portal 2 level creator. And I recently, when I say recently, I say a while ago, I bought the new Mario Maker, thinking I'm going to go crazy and build a lot of Mario Maker levels. But every time I sat there, I just thought I could just go into Unity and like make a little make my own character controller and have a lot more fun
Make it
trying with
do
my
all
own
kinds of
ideas.
different things that you
Yeah,
can't.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. It's like
Uh,
being able to cheat in games. It
mm.
ruins your desire to play them, or having a GM access in an
Yeah, I
MMO.
don't. I have a golden rule. I will never ever apply a cheat to a game until I've already decided I'm done with it normally, because I
Yeah.
just don't trust myself. The minute you apply a cheat to a game, you're allowing yourself to have a cheat whenever you want it, and you're going to lose any interest in the normal sort of cycle of playing it.
Yeah, it totally kills it. The second you summon an item in a game, it's like, why go kill
Yeah,
things
no,
for
no
it?
more curve. I'm done. Yeah, I can just play now. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just get all the items real quick. Let's skip that part. And yeah, it's easy to skip past all the fun. Yeah.
I have a really. This is a really good question, and I really want to be very careful answering it. So here's one. It's uh, Solomon asks or says anyway, how realistic is it to actually apply these principles to a real game? Am I wrong to think that most games are probably not this clean under the hood? So 2 points on that. One, yes, most games are not this clean under the hood, and in fact, the few games that have released their source code that you can see are definitely not this clean. There's examples of like character controllers from Celeste and stuff that do really cool stuff, but they're written quickly to solve problems. But to answer I'm more interested in the second part, which is how practical is this to do in a real game. And so here's my kind of take on this, and I think it's the best way to describe the difference. There are two kinds of applications. It's obviously a lot more, but there's two for the sake of this conversation. There's what I'm going to call event-driven applications, and then there's loop-driven applications. And in most cases, the desktop app you use, whether it's Photoshop or Discord or whatever, it's event-driven. And most games are loop-driven. There's an update loop where things are constantly happening. It may look like it's stationary, but constantly things are moving or updating animators or planning their next movement or attack. But in most desktop applications, nothing is happening until you click, or a polling system is going out every X number of seconds. In contrast to like 60 frames a second, constant update loops, they're not even remotely similar. So when it comes to architecture, architecture is about giving you the freedom to extend and control the scalability of your code and make it easier to work with. And you do that by adding layers. So effectively, you're making things modular by splitting it up and then stacking it together. And that's really cool, but you are building layers that your application has to pass through. So imagine it's like adding doors. Every new layer of architecture is another door your code has to open every time it runs. In an event-driven application, you're doing that once every 10 seconds. Open all the doors, do what you need to do. In a game, you're opening every single door, every single frame, 60 frames a second or more. So each door is a massive consideration. So a lot of the stuff we're saying, they're not to be taken lightly. And there's a reason why a lot of game developers don't do it. It's not because they think that it's not useful. It's because in a lot of cases, your hot primary loop, you can't really afford 50 layers of complexity in architecture. But this is one of those things that comes down to experience. You can use your architecture to set things up. If you're aware of what's loop driven and what's event driven, there are things in your application like initializing and configuration and saving that don't happen every frame, that happen at states in your game where you're saving out a large chunk of data and you want the freedom to choose different sources. Do I save to a database? Do I save to a web service? Do I save over here? Like you want that freedom and you're willing to put up with the micro extra cost of time to go through a layer of two of architecture. But if your main game loop is when this happens, move my character, you don't want to say get input factories, input systems control managers, input handler, just to get the true or false if a thing was pressed. So in general, the answer is yes, this stuff is very applicable to games, but in certain areas of games. And you have to be aware about what your code is doing. And that's why a lot of this stuff purely comes down to experience. And it's very hard to explain to people the difference between code that is where you're getting a benefit from the architecture versus when the architecture is costing you. And so it really comes down to just getting used to it, trying a lot, build a lot of projects, and sort of learn the pros and cons of the architecture. Why is it there in the first place? Because most people don't really think about it. These things aren't here arbitrarily. We're not adding interfaces and concepts because they're fun. We're adding them because they're supposed to add value. And if they're not adding value, you don't need them. So ask if they're adding you value. And if they are, put them into your project. If they're not, don't. That's the golden rule. But figuring out how to get to that answer is what takes time, I guess.
Yeah, sometimes we add them just because they're fun.
That's true. We shouldn't, but
Right.
sometimes we
We
do.
shouldn't, but it definitely happens. Yeah, I think that was a good distinction of the. I think especially that separation of event-driven stuff versus polling stuff. And I mean, some of those scenarios, like your input into your update thing, like that's I think a perfect case for that injection, right? Where you're injecting in that ability to pull that input into this system and not firing off an event every time the player presses a button and then
Yeah.
having everything listen for that event and then firing off an event every frame that you're listening for the button. It would be even worse, right?
Mm.
um, but just injecting that thing in and then polling it.
I
Good,
also
good.
find it's helpful too, because some people often ask me, is like, should I do this, this, or this? And I'm building a text adventure, or I'm building a point and click adventure. And it's like, well, in that instance, you are probably more event driven. So that
100%.
concept
Yeah.
of whether it's event driven or whether it's loop driven is what really is part of your problem, right? Like ask yourself, is am I going to need all of that performance, or would it be better if I could do some really cool modular stuff? So a good example is I would often build a modular system to build guns in my game. Like I could compose cool things and inject bullet factory and put this thing so it adds a modifying system or whatever. And you know what? I don't care that it takes a little bit longer to build the gun because I get all this really cool architectural benefit.
Yeah.
But if I was at runtime, constantly building components, injecting into each other, that would be a waste of time and processing. It would make everything feel sluggish and probably generate a lot of garbage. So there are benefits. You just have to really ask yourself when and why to use it, you know?
Yeah. That all sounds good. And somebody was asking on here about a rider. Um, I just
I,
wanted
I,
to answer you because we talk about it a lot. I talk
I
about it a
do,
lot.
yeah. I talk
Um,
about it a lot too.
yeah, I would say it's worth it. Try out they have a free trial. Just give it a try and force yourself to use it for a month. That's kind of what I did. And after the end of the month, I didn't want to switch back. But I mean, I feel like you have to force yourself to
Yeah,
actually use it,
changing
right?
into anything is tough, and it's a big departure from Visual Studio if you've used it a lot.
It feels very different, but I felt like it was worth the payoff. It was worth that cost of paying for it and then trying it out. So I would go for it.
Keep in
Um,
mind, if you're a student, you can get it either for free or for really cheap. Like JetBrains are really, really good about giving you their entire suite of tools if you're a student. So if you can prove it, and they've got an entire request feature for students, like there's no reason not to. If you can get your hands on it as a student for either free or really cheap, definitely go for it.
yeah, I would highly recommend that. I didn't even think about that. You can get it for
Mhm.
free, even better. But if you can't, just get the trial and try it out. It's worth it.
Yeah.
It definitely improves the code, and it's mostly just the constant recommendations and reminders that it pops up. Right, it gives you good tips on how to improve your code, and it'll save you more than whatever it is, $7 worth of time a month. At least it does for me. It's
Yeah.
relatively constant. It's just like, oh yeah, hey, look at that little optimization. Oh, look at this little thing. And a lot of time I'll just learn something new.
Yeah.
It'll recommend something. I'll hit Alt Enter, click on the article, and go read it. And I'm like, oh, that's some new little thing I never would have thought of outside of here.
Yeah, there's so many little things. I don't even use all of the tools it has. Just the ones I have. It's every time I decide to. Kind of like we talked about profiling. Every so often, I'll take a break from coding and I'll just say, writer shortcuts. And I'll just try to find a new one and I'll just spend a couple of weeks just trying to like burn it into my brain because it makes things a bit faster. And over time, you just get these micro optimizations to the point that you find yourself cutting out hours of time writing repetitious code because you're doing these really small things very fast.
Yeah, my favorite now is Control Shift Alt and the arrows going up and down with
That move a
those.
method up and down?
It moves whatever your selected code is up and down, but it doesn't move them up by a line. It moves them up by execution context. So it'll move
Oh,
them above
nice.
whatever the previously executing line was or inside the brackets or whatever. It doesn't just go up by a space. So it actually
I'm
jumps
gonna have to
up.
keep that one in mind. Actually, I have
Um,
not used that. I
it's
can see a
also
lot of
really
value.
nice for
Yeah.
reordering methods because you can just select the
Yeah.
method and hit Control Shift Alt and up or down to move it up or down. And it just bounces that
I
whole
have this
method below the
personal
next one.
preference. I like putting the constructor. If it's an empty constructor with no parameters in, well, if it's an empty constructor and it's not assigning anything, even if
Yeah.
it's got parameters being passed to the base class, I always move to the bottom of my file because it
Oh,
doesn't add any value.
yeah.
I like to read when I open a file. I like it to say these are the public functions and here's the public properties you're going to use. If there are things that help other things work, I hide them at the bottom because realistically, I want it to read in terms of if you'd open this file, what's the most valuable thing you should want to see? And
Right.
like if I've got like a, you know, application saver of some kind, I want the save function to be the first thing you see. Even if I have variables that go to other places and have different file paths and stuff, the first thing I'm going to want to see is the save thing.
You
And then
just want
after
that
that, you
save
can go
method
to,
right up
yeah.
top.
So I always do that, or at the end I'll cut my constructor down, and I have a bad habit of doing it manually. So I'm gonna keep that. I'm gonna keep that one in
That's
mind
funny.
for the next time.
Yeah, that's an interesting layout. So, yeah, I've got my own little set of layout. I'm curious where do you put, or do you have like a set order that you like to put things in your
Yeah.
file? Like, I mean, I'm all with you on the public methods and then private methods below. Ideally, I
So
assume in like the newspaper pattern where they're kind of as they're used.
yeah. So exactly. I've that's one of those things again I took from Bob Martin that really kind of stuck with me is um the your first instinct when you start designing your structure is to put things in logical groupings. So most people start with here's my private fields, here's my public properties, here's my public methods, here's my private methods. And that's sort of the general concept people think about.
Yeah,
But the problem is when you go to read that, what you don't realize is you tend to read a method and then say, oh, this method calls these two methods. Where's that one? And you start chasing it down. And if you've done that structure, you'll be at the top of your file reading a public method. You'll then F12 in or whatever to jump to a private one down here. You'll then jump to another private one. You'll then see some variables being used. You might want to scroll up to the fields at the top to figure out which ones they are and what they're set to. And then you scroll back down again, and you're basically increasing your travel time across the application. So I tend to try to put things grouped in logical groups of how they functionally work. So if I've got a public method and it's called two private functions, I will put public method and underneath it the two private functions that are
yeah,
being called by that function. So I try to keep them grouped relative to what they're doing. Obviously, in some cases, if there's a lot of private functions, there's a lot of public ones, I might change it around. But in
sure. And if they're
general,
reused between multiple
exactly,
publics,
yeah. Like I tend to aim. I go with the mindset of if you'd open the file, what are you trying to do? You're either trying to find where this is or modify this feature. And I can make a good guess as to what you'd be trying to edit. So I try to structure things in a way that would help you do that effectively. And nobody's going to be injecting stuff in the constructor. That's like the lowest case that's going to happen. You're not going to be opening the constructor with the intention of adding a new parameter to it. You're first going to try to edit a script, and then you might find a dependency you need, and then you go down to the constructor and add it. So realistically, it's probably the least valuable to have at the top of the file.
makes sense. Yeah, I like to follow pretty similar structure. Except the one thing I like to call out is static stuff. I always shove right to the top because I feel like
Yeah, I think I do too. I
it's
never
doing
thought about it.
something weird and it's doing something that I feel like just needs to be called out instantly in my code. Like if there's something that's static, it's always like the first thing in there. Like this is a static thing that's here and it's different for some reason because it's relatively rare that there's something static in there. So I want to
Yeah.
make sure that it's very obvious that it's there and that it's different and unique.
Same with const. If I have any const
Yeah,
values, I want to say these are clearly important to this file. Keep an eye on them before you go down to the rest of the the
yeah,
rest of the file.
constants. And do you do the all uppercase
Screaming caps.
constants?
That's what I go every time. And
Uh,
the thing is, it's not the default on Writer. So I every time I reinstall Writer on a new machine, I go in and say, nope, my rule for constants is screaming caps every time. Stop getting it wrong, Writer.
That's too funny. Yeah, I like them the same way. It's just like it makes it so obvious that it's not a variable. Like this thing is
Yeah.
not a variable. It's not changing. Like you don't
Yeah.
have to worry about it. You can just use it. It's the main reason I do it, right? And so that nobody also goes in and changes it to be non-const later. I don't want them thinking like, oh, this is just const for no reason. I'll just go change it, and then they'll make some code that modifies it somewhere else. And
Yep.
yeah, I want to make sure that it's very obvious and you don't screw it up.
Actually, that's one Blind mentions. He asked, where do you put fields? That's one we might differ on. I
Oh,
put
okay.
my private fields at the bottom of my file near the constructor.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I put mine at the top.
Yeah, yeah. So
Um,
I thought we might differ on that one.
yeah, I give all my private fields at the top, but they're also that could also just be like a coming from a C++ habit side. Like this is why I do it. But I just feel like it lets me know if my class is getting too big too. Because if I see a
That's
bunch of
fair.
them up there, I'm like, I got 6 private fields here. Like maybe this should be 2 classes. You know?
I firmly took to heart the idea of there's a division between public facing features and implementation details. And I consider private fields by definition are what I'm using internally to do my job. And people don't need to know that.
Yeah.
I can just have a box here of the stuff that I need to do the job I've assigned. I am publicly saying these are public properties I need. These, so they'll be right at the top. Anything
Yeah.
that's got a setter that's public up there, or any property that's public with a getter,
Yeah.
because the idea is you might want to get this
You
and
might
figure
want
out
to
what it
read it.
is. But anything that's private fields, I'm like, if you're at the point you need to know what the private fields are, you're already reading a function, trying to figure out what it does. So you're already in the bowels of the private methods anyway. So now you're down at the bottom near the other private stuff. At the top, you're trying to read it and say, what does this do? And by the time you're looking for private fields, you're already like, well, now I want to know how it does it. And that's where it's an implementation detail.
That's a good point. I don't know. I could probably be convinced because it does make sense. I don't know. I just, like I said, for me, the biggest thing is just seeing that there are too many and like my class is probably doing too much. But I think having them, I mean, if they're all the way at the bottom, I guess that could work. The thing I hate is when they're scattered throughout the middle
Yeah,
of
that
the
I
file.
agree. Like, I will only ever do that if there's a particular variable that for whatever reason has to be class scoped, but is only used by one thing. I'll put it directly above it on very rare occasions, but
Yeah.
that would have to be a very specific case.
Right. Yeah. Because that's the one that drives me nuts. But I could see. I mean, the argument for shoving them at the bottom is relatively strong. I wonder if everybody in chat agrees. 'Cause, I mean, realistically, somebody coming in looking at it shouldn't be digging into those at all. They shouldn't necessarily care about it unless they need to work on that class, right? If they're just interacting with it, they shouldn't care about it. And I guess
That
having
being
them.
said, though, I think you said on another video that is probably very relevant here. I can't remember. You definitely mentioned this before. Is regardless of which one of these you pick, what matters more importantly is you follow the rules of the system you're in. If
Yes,
you're
and the
working in a
team and
team,
project.
you
Yes.
follow the team's guidelines and rules.
Match whatever the rest of the team is doing. And if the rest of the team isn't matching what they're doing, try to change that. Start asking, like, what are our standards? What can I do to, like, it's really hard to, you don't want to just go in there and be like, hey, I think we should do these coding standards. I have a doc here. Let's do this. I'll start putting it in for you. Like that's a good way to just piss people off, right? But you can go in
You
and
have to be
start
sneaky.
asking.
You have to go in and say, "Hey guys, I'm thinking of adding style cop, so we're going to put in some rules so it automatically fixes these things. What do we all agree we should do?"
Start by asking what they are first.
Yeah.
It's funny because most of the time I think projects start off with some coding standards doc, and then it gets written, looked at, agreed upon, and then lost forever. It just kind of disappears. At least that's what I've seen a lot of the time, right? Like, okay, these are the standards. Here's the doc. Nobody knows where the doc is after today, and nobody's ever seen it again. Nobody that joins the team after sees it, and nobody follows it.
I will say though, normally from experience, like from my experience anyway, is that whoever writes the first parts of the system get to dictate the rules. Because personally, when I'm brought onto a team, I will follow whatever guidelines I see because I want my code to be consistent.
Right.
And I think most people I've worked with do that anyway. So if you get to write the first few scripts, you tend to dictate how the guidelines will work. But if you join a team, most people are going to be polite and follow the guidelines. It's only really, in my experience, graduates who aren't paying attention to what the style is for everybody else. You know,
Um,
I could be
I don't
wrong.
know.
That's just my experience.
I would say that could be the case if the project stays on like this set of standards, but the second that you see it mixed up and that like
Oh yeah,
one
yeah.
file looks this way, one
broken
file,
window theory.
it just explodes into like
Yeah.
everybody's doing things slightly differently.
Yeah. As
And
soon as
then
someone
that
convinces themselves there are no
diverges further.
guidelines, they're fine. Yeah, they can. I'll do whatever I want now. There's no guidelines in place.
Yeah, and that's what I've seen happen on almost every big project that went over like a year. Is unless there's somebody actively managing the coding standards and getting people together working on this stuff, it tends to just slip apart. And then people will come together and agree on something again, then it'll slip apart again. Yeah, I think you have to be like a style cop or something is a great option. Like if you can get the team to agree on it and just get everybody working in a system where everything looks the same, it's a whole lot nicer. It's very, very easy to screw that up. In
Yeah.
fact, I've seen it happen over and over. Or stuff,
Mm.
or like it's all nice and good at first, for the first year, and then suddenly like people start swapping out. Some people leave, other people come in, do it slightly differently, and then it just slowly.
What worries me more than that though is I find it's one thing if somebody's not following the exact capitalization conventions or some use underscore and some don't. That's annoying, but you can kind of look over it in certain cases. What bothers me is when there's no glossary of terms. So you're both working or multiple people are working on a project and there's certain entities in the project that people are using vaguely different names for. You know, like you've
Yeah,
got I've had some things where it's like I wish I could come up with a good example, but there'll be sort of like a bank balance or something, and people will be using the different terms for account or balance or whatever, not in the class name, but like in how they'll define the variable. Like some people will use ACC for account, others will use account in full account, other people will use, account or system or whatever. They'll use different names. And so
yeah,
as you start to go through the code, you're trying to think, hang on a second, do they mean account as the account manager, or do they mean account as in the person's account, or do they mean the accounting of this account? And all of a sudden you're kind of going, nobody's agreeing that this word means that thing.
yeah. I've seen that a lot too,
Oh,
and
player versus actor. There we go. A
yeah,
perfect example. Yeah.
player
I use
versus
actor
actor
myself.
versus
Yeah.
entity. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Yep. It's the same kinds of things. The naming part especially drives me nuts, and
Mm.
abbreviating things. It makes it so much harder to find what it
Yeah.
is you're searching for and to just understand the code when everything
And,
gets
and and this
shortened out.
goes to another thing too. I will only abbreviate things if they're being used in the next one or two lines. That is it. I don't abbreviate stuff that the idea is if you're abbreviating something, you have to be using it in the scope you're looking at. So if you abbreviate something at the top of the file and it's being used in a method at the bottom of the file, you're already lost the context of what the thing was. So
Right.
I will often use abbreviations, and that's why it's okay to use abbreviations in for loops or for eaches or in lambdas, because usually they're literally their life cycle is this long. It's one
Right.
or two lines, and you can basically read where it started and where it ended up. But yeah, so abbreviations should be avoided unless you're literally like about to use it in line.
Right. Yeah. And I'll use short variable names for that, and not necessarily abbreviations, but at least cutting out the as many extra words on scenarios like that, or where I'm accessing the thing like 20 times afterwards. Like it's some object where I've got to reference 20 properties on it or
Oh yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
and set all of these different things. Like it's a network message, right? Like I'll put MSG whatever because I
yeah,
don't want to
100%.
do
And also,
network message dot whatever equals this, and yeah.
and what about vars then? Because that's a similar thing. What do you do about vars?
VAR's the same way. If it's very obvious what the thing is, like I'm getting a player and I have var player equals get player, totally fine. If
Yeah, I'm
it's
exactly the same. Yeah, the
yeah,
same thing. If you're going to be writing character equals new character,
yes,
writing var char equals new character, and then using it in the next two lines, perfectly fine. The context is
yes,
very clear as to what's going on.
exactly, yeah. But if it's something where then the type isn't going to be 100% super obvious from the variable name, which most of the time it should. But if there is a case where it might not, then that's when I'll use the actual class name instead of
Yeah.
var. Yeah, but ideally the variable name should be enough to tell you exactly what the object is.
But I will say though, this brings up a good point. Someone else asked. They said they hate the underscore
Oh,
for class scope variables, and I think this exact argument we've just said is exactly why I still favor the underscore.
yeah,
Because when you've got an application like a health system, you will have the private field health, the public property health, the health that's incoming in the set health function, and then the health going out in the health, in some other property for like calculating percentage health. So the word health exists like 6 times throughout the course of your application. And
yeah,
one of those is the real value that all the other ones are using, that is basically the class scoped variable. So underscore health universally, no matter where you are in the code, is changing the stored value on this object. Every other one is either an in transit value coming in or going out. And so that is a very clear, it comes back to that statement of, is the code you're writing adding value? If you see underscore and it's not adding value because it's noise, fine. But for me, I look at it and I go, this tells me that this health is the one I am using and it's the one that's important for this context. So I find value in it, and that's why I still use it.
Same here. Yeah, I get the same value over very, very minimal space, right? You get that one little character, and suddenly you know, like, this is a private field. It shouldn't be accessed outside. It should probably be getting set by a very specific method. It shouldn't. It's usually not something that I should just be modifying. And I know it's not a parameter. I'm not It avoids the really annoying case of I was accidentally using a parameter and trying to figure out why the hell this thing didn't work for the last 2 hours. But it's because I was changing an input parameter, not the actual
Yeah,
local
yeah.
field, because I didn't realize that they had the same name or a very similar name.
Or the worst, the circular dependency, where you're assigning a value to a setter that's actually assigning the value to the same
To
thing, and
itself,
you're
yeah.
yeah, I've done that before too.
Yeah, so it's I'm back on the underscore 100%. I went away. I stopped using it for a little while with editor tooling because the editor tooling gave me kind of the same thing. But then I realized like everyone's not going to install the same editor tools as me.
Yeah.
It's a bad idea. So I just went back to just underscore. It's everybody pretty much understands it. I'd say the majority of developers, they get in there, they're going to understand it, and if they don't, you can explain it really easily, and it's a pretty well-known standard. So
I
I
also
think,
think it adds one other bit of value to me personally, which is I used to love using the setter functions in every case I could. So for example, I would have a private underscore health field or whatever, and I would have my getter and setter as a health value. So capital H health, that would be setting that underscore health and getting that underscore health. And I used to, in my functions down below where I calculated values or removed from health, I would say capital H health equals whatever the new value is, and I would be constantly using the getter and setter property. But that's a bad practice because you're adding this extra layer. We talked before about architecture and why you'd use it. Why would you go through another variable in the form of a get method or a set method just to go down to set an underscore value on a field when you can just say underscore health equals? Because realistically, that's what you're doing. You're accessing that value. Different story if you're trying to use guard clauses and things. But in general, my point is anytime I want to modify the health value, I should be using the class scoped health value. I'm explicitly modifying. And so having the underscore isn't just useful because I know that it's the class scoped one. It's a reminder that if I have any functions that modify health, they shouldn't be going through some arbitrary other property. They should literally be using the class scoped one at every time I hit it.
yeah, that makes sense. On that note, how often do you find yourself using public properties with private setters? I do that quite
Um,
often. I'm kind of curious.
yeah, I do, but actually, I actually have a video on this. It was there was one day I took over from Charles's channel for a day. He was away at a meeting, and I went on a big video where I kind of discussed when and where I use getters, setters, and different fields, and it basically boils down to there's a there's a trade-off for every single decision that you make in terms of access modifiers on a file on a variable. If you make it public, you get editor serialization in Unity, but everything can mess with the value and you can get into negative values and weird stuff. If you make it private, you can no longer edit it in the editor and you can control what people gate to use it. You can serialize the field. Now you can access it in the editor again, and now people are safe from using it. So you can now make it a public getter to access that field and you have control over it. And basically, I kind of went through the stages like that, and it boils down to I would use a private serialized field with an onValidate function to gate whatever issues the public serializing will give me, because people can still set it to negative values. And then I will use a setter on a getter where applicable, so that in scripts I access it via those functions. So long story short, script to script, I will always use a property. I won't ever access fields by scripts. And in the editor, I would use a onValidate function to guard against any weird values being assigned.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah,
That's I'd say
long-winded, but
I'd
it's
like to follow the same rules generally.
yeah.
I find a lot of the time, it's probably half the time, I end up not needing a private field at all and just having a private setter on a public property for things that aren't editor, modifiable. Like thinking of a health value, right? Like I may have just a public like a health class with a value on it that's got a public getter and a private setter, that's changing that value. But for all the inspector stuff, I'm 100%. Like I almost always just do like an expression body property to read the
Yeah.
private field, the private serialized field. So I still end up with just the 2 lines instead of a whole lot of stuff there at least.
Yeah, I do the same.
I find it makes it easy to read and still gives you all those benefits. Um, it's good stuff. Oh, were there any
Yeah.
other things you wanted to hit before we wrap up? I know we're almost at
Well,
like
just one
three
last thing.
hours.
People are talking about Hungarian notation in the chat, and that's one I don't use. And it's to come back to the question of what value it adds. This is one where again it's up to the discussion we mentioned before, which is does it add value? And so for people who don't know, Hungarian notation is where you literally denote in front of it what type it is. So that used to be used when compilers were you didn't have the editors we have now, which dynamically tells you the types, and two, you used to have to compile your code onto things like actual cards and then load them up. And so if you made a mistake in something as silly as trying to assign a string to an int or an int to a string, you could literally lose hours waiting for you to have to rebuild and print out things. So back then, it was a very practical use to remind yourself as you went through it that this is the right types you're matching. But these days, that's one of those things you don't need. The question becomes, is it adding value? Well, technically, yes, you can. It tells you what type it is. But do I need that value? Not really. Usually, I can say thing equals other thing. And if it's a compile time error where I'm trying to assign a string to an int or an int to a string, it will tell me that something's wrong. And so it's not even like I'm going to accidentally hit it. I will find out in real time if I make that mistake. So adding that information doesn't really help me. So I don't use it because it literally doesn't add value.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. And I'd heard before that initially the goal of it wasn't even to denote the type of the object, but the use of the object, like marking things as counters, that it's
Oh,
supposed
that
to be
makes sense.
used as
Yeah.
a counter, or I forget the other types. I
Pointers
remember
and
hearing
stuff.
it in a
Yeah.
talk some time
Pointers is a
ago.
big one because pointers used to be one that gets overridden a lot.
Yeah,
You get into weird scenarios.
and it was supposed to be just like whatever the usage of the thing was. But I also saw like, we used to have G underscore whatever for global stuff, and you know, some of these other ones sound familiar. It's been too long since I used Hungarian notation though.
Mm.
And then somebody else was asking why you would use var. I think we talked about it a little bit, but the biggest point is just to reduce and make it easier to read, right? If the
Yeah.
variable name matches the type name, then it just reduces the amount that you have to read and makes it faster to go through.
Yeah, it really comes down to, again, is it adding value? I know that sounds like a cliche at this stage, but if I had the line var result equals get thing, that's very confusing. What is the result and what is the thing? You have no information. In that instance, if it's character, as much as I wouldn't use those names, character
Result.
result equals get thing,
Yeah.
at least tells you the result is a character, right?
Right.
But if you had character equals new character, I think you've got a good guess that's a character. And changing the first one to be var character equals new character, you're still not losing the fact that it's a character. Hell, var c equals new character, you're still not losing the fact that it's a character.
Right.
So as long as
Unless you're going more
yeah,
lines down. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So
Like I
as long
said.
as you can still tell what it is, you can get rid of a few extra words with a var.
Yeah. Which is a very good point. 'Cause people always give me crap for using var, but
Yeah,
I really love it because it just makes it easier to read the code.
Cleaner, yeah.
And I figure if you can still read the code and you can read it even easier, it's a win. Yeah. I don't know. Were
That's
there
all I've
any
got, I
other
think, yeah.
just things on our list you wanted to hit before we wrap up?
To be honest, we've covered a lot more than I thought we could. So I'm more than happy with the amount we covered.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot today. This is a lot of fun though. I want to do this more
Yeah,
often.
yeah, it's great fun.
Just chatting about random stuff, code stuff. I got a lot of other topics I want to talk about now.
I'm sure we could do this again and we only hit about 3 or 4 things on our list. We've got about 20 here. We could go through next time.
Let me pull that up. So we got, there's a lot of things.
Yeah.
Pooling, solid principles, design patterns, static stuff,
Light
probes,
probes, gizmos,
lighting,
yeah.
state machines. Yeah, a lot of things we can talk about next time, I guess. Just, I don't know, do some more calls. Somebody's asking if Jason has a channel. He does not. I keep telling him he should. He's been on Charles' Infallible Code channel quite a bit though, and did his own stream there. I would go check it out. It was worth watching for sure. And it's just interesting listening to the two of them talk about different code stuff and do code reviews on projects and stuff. And eventually he'll start a channel. He's got a camera now and a
Yes,
backdrop
I have
and
a
a
good
mic.
camera now, so maybe I will.
He almost has enough headphones to do it. All right.
Almost.
So yeah, I think that'd be good stuff. I'd be happy to promote the hell out of it. Yeah. Anyway, let's do this again sometime soon. If you guys are interested and want to see more talks like this, just remember to share the video and hit the like button. An odd number of times, I guess. Yeah. And
But
then
if I do make a channel, you're gonna have to be a guest on it. It's
oh yeah, no, I'd love
mandatory.
to. It'd be a blast. And just hop on there. Yeah, anytime. I don't know. And then yeah, I don't know. I got nothing else. You got anything else to say before we sign off?
I think that's it. Just thanks for watching, and do give the poor guy an upvote. I should be the one to say it for a change, because it's people don't realize how uncomfortable it is when you have a channel, and it really does help. It helps because the way the whole algorithm works, every single upvote genuinely helps, and it can be very frustrating having to keep saying that. But honestly, people underestimate that. So please upvote the video if you
Or
can.
just share it. It's even better.
Or share it even.
Just share it. Yeah, we're good to go. Anyway, yeah, thanks again, everybody. Appreciate having everyone out here, and a special thanks to Jason, because it's just awesome chatting with you about this stuff.
Yeah, it's good fun. Good fun.
Have
Thanks for
fun,
having me.
I feel like I learned something new every time we talk, so it's good stuff. Cool. All right. Well, I guess we'll sign